You ready?
Yeah, let's go.
You ready, man?
Party people in the place to be. It's about that time for us to.
Yeah. What you know about going out? Head west, red legs, TVs, all up in the headrest.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Tech Beats Unplugged, the podcast where we groove into the latest tech trends and vibe with the flow of cloud possibilities. I'm your host, 𝐭𝐤𝐴, aka Cloud Dude, and I'm pumped to be here with y'all. And boy, you're really in for a treat today as we've got another insane guest for you in this episode. And I feel immensely honored and lucky. What am I saying? You're lucky. And don't even ask me how I pull this off. But as I said, we're incredibly fortunate to have this brilliant man blessing us with his presence and wisdom. His journey has been nothing short of inspiring. He's a thought leader, not only renowned for his groundbreaking contributions to Kubernetes and open source software, but he's been one of the most influential figures in tech industry over the past decade, especially in the cloud native and DevOps space. He's the co-author of the book Kubernetes Up and Running, CNCF Ambassador, and one of the co-founders of the KubeCon conference. Today, despite his retirement, rumors has it that he's still whispering to the ears of cloud engineers as he continues to empower and inspire developers across the world to build smarter, scalable, and highly usable systems. I'm so excited to host the one and only Kelsey Hightower. Welcome, brother, and thank you for being here.
I'm super happy to be here. That is an impressive intro, so I really appreciate all of those kind words.
Oh, thank you. How you doing?
Fantastic. I'm in maybe month 3 of retirement. Doesn't feel so much like retirement because I'm still super busy, but it's kind of nice to kind of pick and choose exactly the things I work on. So I'm learning how to do that too.
Sounds good. Can't wait to learn more about it. All right. So we call this episode simply Journey into Tech with Kelsey. In this episode, Kelsey and I will obviously discuss a range of topics like cloud native, DevOps, Kubernetes, serverless, you name it. But I also want to know more about the man himself. You got it. We're not just talking about tech. I'll start with a few fun facts, Kelsey, and then you get to tell me more about yourself. So here's some facts for you. The year you were born, Ronald Reagan becomes the 40th president of the United States. The first DeLorean is produced for sale. A movie ticket is $278. Minimum wage is $335. And the cost of a gigabyte of data storage is $300,000. Not so bad. Okay, so you were born and grew up in Long Beach, California, the hometown of Snoop Dogg, Nate Dogg, and Warren G. Damn, talking about hip-hop influence. What was it like?
Long Beach was nice. I mean, you know, this is in the 80s for people trying to figure out the time period. I was born in 81. And during that time period, we went outside. That's kind of a foreign concept to a lot of people I know. But, you know, for me, no internet access. We did have things like Nintendo and Atari. But the best thing that I looked forward every day was just going outside for as long as possible. So in the summertime, you left, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., and you didn't come back unless you were hungry. Maybe you had to use the bathroom. But other than that, you're outside for as long as possible. And for me, that would be riding bikes. Maybe riding bikes in places you weren't supposed to, like the riverbed, those, places. Sewage used to flow through there. So I can't believe we used to ride our bikes on those, but we did. And then, of course, playing basketball at the local elementary school for as long as possible. So I really enjoyed my childhood. I think a lot of my people skills were developed, just being outside, different age groups, and you're just kind of learning how to just kind of deal with like the real world in a real world setting. And I think a lot of people miss out on that in their youth if you're behind a computer all day. So I really enjoyed the fact that I spent so much time outside.
Sounds so cool, man. I mean, I had some of this when I was a kid as well. Okay, so you later moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Tell me how you got into the whole tech bazinga from there, because that's where I lost track from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I played sports throughout all of my schooling, ran track, ran the 200 meters, 400 meters. Even though I'm only 5'9", I did the high jump, was pretty good at it. And also played football, quarterback, and defensive back. Deion Sanders was one of my favorite players. And so my whole career was like focused around sports. Growing up in Long Beach, California, there's a very popular high school, Long Beach Poly. My guess is they produce, one of the number one entrants into the NFL. And so that's very much a sports town.
Yeah.
And so for me, my whole kind of view on the world was like sports. And so moving mid ninth grade to Atlanta, I missed half a school year. So I didn't go to school year. My mom was getting settled, moving to Atlanta. And so there was a lot of adjustments. Number one, the West Coast of the U.S. is very different than the South of the U.S.
Oh, man.
So I had to make a lot of adjustments. Of course, you're making new friends, leaving old friends behind. And so for me, life revolved around sports. And in order to get enough credits to catch up for that missing half a year, one of the classes I took was called the TSA, Technology Student Association. And it was an after-school club. It gave you extra credits, and you were just exposed to everything. We were writing, I guess, code on a TI-86 calculator.
Wow.
TI Basic, and you would just copy and paste programs to make like a Snake video game or even Tetris. But it had a full-blown programming language, so you can write little apps and like share them with your friends. So TI Basic was probably like the first programming language that I learned in 10th grade. But you also got exposure to do things like AutoCAD, drawing floor plans to spec, printing out, getting all the dimensions, building bridges, stress testing them. So that was like my first exposure to technology. And then it became something I was a little bit interested in. So during the normal school year, I decided to take the technology elective and just kind of keep that going. So for me, that was kind of my first entry into the world of technology. So not someone who was coding at a young age, not someone who ever thought about being this as a profession, because at that time, I didn't know anyone that was doing this as a job. I kind of only looked up to athletes, and I would say at that time, that was pretty much it. And so getting that taste of technology, I think really at least planted the seed that this is something that I could do. But that was definitely my entry point into this whole space.
So there was no role model really in tech for you?
Not at that time, because that's like 1997, 98. Mm-hmm. And so just like other people, I'm super excited to have like a Windows laptop. At that point, I was probably only using it to play Age of Empires, like the real-time strategy game. And so for me, computers were just more of a thing you used to play video games. I didn't know anyone that was a software developer. I didn't know anyone that was a system administrator. And most people I knew didn't have a computer at home.
Wow.
That wasn't like the normal thing where everyone just has a computer in their house. And so like the computer thing, I think the excitement of people standing in line for Windows 98, I do remember that launch, it was on the news and it was like this big reveal to the world. And I think that's when, you can definitely feel like computers were just coming of age. Like there was so much more you can do than like spreadsheets and, basic applications. But again, it still never dawned on me that you could be the person writing the software. I just thought you just like movies, right? I never saw myself making movies. You just consumed them.
True.
So all of my experience at that point in time was you just consume, go to a school, and maybe you take a typing class. But to me, that was the extent of it. Didn't know anyone that was actually building things in that world.
Wow. Nice. And your first job opportunity, like your first entry into the tech world, how did it happen?
I mean, and I'm pretty sure that I come from a very similar background to most people. Like all of my early jobs were like fast food restaurants. Anything that was walkable distance from where I lived, that's where I was applying for jobs. You would just make the rounds, McDonald's, Subway, grocery store, or something like Pizza Hut. And then those would be the jobs that if you got them, you use those jobs, to buy school clothes, things that you needed. Mm-hmm. And so for me, my early jobs were just like, look, I'll take that minimum wage. It was a little bit more than what you quoted earlier. But for me, a job was a job. And so for me, what I learned at those jobs was just like how to actually be good at anything, right? So if you were turned to go clean the bathroom or sweep the lobby, you took it seriously, right? You didn't do it like with a bad attitude. And I kind of looked up to the store managers and the shift managers because they were the people that giving you direction on like how to work in this fast-paced environment. And look, you were not working a highly respected job. Like you're a McDonald's employee. People yell at you when their food is cold, right? That kind of vibe and attitude. But at the end of the day, though, I did learn a lot of responsibilities because at some point, even at like the age of 15, 16, you become a shift manager, right? So you have all of these keys. You tell people when to clock in, when to clock out, and you really learn how to run the shift. Make sure everything runs smoothly. Make sure that all the money is accounted for in a cash register, filling out the timesheets, filling out everything, making sure everything was spot on. But I think learning that kind of work ethic and like how to run a team, even a team running a McDonald's, was very influential. When I graduated high school in Georgia, where I was at in Atlanta, if you had a B average, you went to school at one of the public schools close to free. You still had to pay for things like books, but most of the tuition was covered for you. It was called the HOPE program. And so I enrolled in a local college, and I think I signed up for maybe a computer science related field, but boy, those initial classes were so boring. I was like, this can't be it. Like, what is this Microsoft Word? And look, I probably blamed the curriculum of that particular college more than anything else, but I didn't have the patience to go through school for another 4 years. And I was like, there has to be a better way. And so I decided that I would go the certification route. And I started with like the A+ certification. Go to the bookstore. I think that book was like $30. And I remember just feeling like this was a much better introduction to the world of computing. All the examples, you learned about hardware and software. There were quizzes in the back. You know, you open the back of the book, there's a CD, you put it in your computer, and you would just take these practice quizzes. And I think it was the first time that I felt like learning about computers, I could actually track my progress. Like the more I learned, the more chapters that I read, the better I would do on those practice exams. And so I felt like I was gaining all of this knowledge. I knew what a motherboard was. I knew that electricity flowed through those circuits. I knew that RAM played a pivotal role in how computers operated. So learning things at that level, with all the diagrams, with all the reinforced learning from taking those practice exams, I felt like that was a better pace and challenge for me at that time. And so when I got that first A+ certification, I don't know, I kind of felt as good as probably someone who had graduated with a 4-year degree. I felt like I had something that was super real, because at that time, now we're talking like 1999, 2000,
Wow.
job postings that you would read are like, hey, A+ certification, like we want to see that, or maybe a Microsoft certification. So I felt like I was on track to jump into those industries. And I remember getting my Network Plus certification in Atlanta on the north side of town. There were like these little, they call them code schools these days, but there are these places that would help you focus on getting your certifications, right? You would come in, they have these cram sessions, and their goal was to try to get you to pass that test in a week. I don't think cramming was the right way of doing that. For me, I actually just bought the book and spent months combing through the details. But either way, I get my Network Plus certification, and I remember just walking out, and they had like this career day. And at that time, Bell South, which is like a locust ISP, probably known as AT&T these days, but they were rolling out high-speed internet. So we're going from dial-up to DSL, and it was much faster than what dial-up was doing. But here's the thing. All the people that they hired as full-time employees, they were really good at running phone lines, terminating phone lines, and of course, you just hooked up your computer via phone line into the socket in the wall, and it was very same infrastructure being repurposed for the internet. But DSL was a bit different. Typically, a new line was run, and that thing carried data only, and a modem had to be installed. And typically, it was either a USB modem that required drivers, or an Ethernet card if your computer was like a little too outdated for some of the newer drivers. And that was the first job that I got into tech. It was like a contract job. Either people's internet wasn't working and you went and troubleshoot it and you fixed it, or it was a brand new install and you would just make sure that the connection was good from the street. You ran Cat5 cable if you had to, you got to the computer, you installed the drivers, and you got them online. And I loved that pace, because every day you would drive around town, maybe 4 or 5 stops in a day between updates, repairs, and new installs. And it became this thing that when you were really good, you could come in and do a new install in like 20 minutes.
Wow.
And you got paid per install. I mean, back then, I think you were getting like $75 if you fixed the problem, and you got like $150 if it was a brand new install.
Oh.
And so, boy, at the age of like 19, 20, making that kind of money in a day, life was really good.
Yeah, that's the bling bling hustle, but in tech side. It's cool. So cool. Okay, so I still want to know more about the man. Sorry about that, but I'm going to dig a little bit more. Everybody knows Kelsey mostly to his strong link to Kubernetes, but obviously it ain't just about Kubernetes, ain't it? So my question is, what's the biggest misconception people have about you? And if I have a dinner with 3 of your best friends and ask them to describe you, what would I learn?
Yeah, some people might say I'm cheap, but this just comes from that same time period of like becoming a minimalist. And at that time period, you know, there's a lot of backstory. I used to also, after doing that contract work, I realized that there was more work. Like you would go to a business and they wouldn't have a router or a switch, and they wanted 5 computers online, not just the one that you were obligated to set up. And so I remembered like, hey, here's my card. I can come back after hours and I can totally like network the whole place. But, you know, I have to go get a router, I have to get a switch, we got to run some cables, but I can totally do it. And that was the foundation for starting like my own business. So one part, there was a computer store a little bit outside of Atlanta, and I would buy parts wholesale. And this would be the kind of place you would walk in and you would buy like modems, keyboards, mice, you know, those little $5 mice that only cost me $2. But those are the kind of things that people would need locally, because the other alternative was like CompUSA. Things were pretty expensive, or you had to buy a brand new computer from Dell. So getting what you had repaired was kind of a big deal. People were not going to spend thousands of dollars every time they wanted, you know, a new computer to get things fixed. And so they would come by my shop. Removing viruses was big business, right? People would do weird things on the internet and show up and say, hey, I don't know how this stuff got on my computer. It's like, oh, I know how it got on your computer, but I ain't got to tell anybody. We'll get you all cleaned up. And so, and then continue to do those service calls. But instead of installing internet, I was also doing things like networking or being the tech support for small insurance companies, right? Whenever they got a new software package, they needed updates, or they need to, you know, connect 2 offices together, we would be their people. And so on top of that, having that business acumen, now I'm like 20, 21 years old, and I'm the computer guy with the computer store. And my friends and their parents would stop by, and it was pretty good for a while. And one day, one of my friends from high school, he was a comedian. And he was like, hey, I'm a comedian. I'm looking like, I don't know. I ain't never seen you really be funny. Not like the comedians you see on TV. So what does it mean you're a comedian? And he just came by the shop. And once I closed the shop around 7 or 8 in the evening, people would just come by the shop and just hang out. And there was a reason for that, because when I got that shop, I didn't have enough money for an apartment and the shop. I had to pick.
Damn.
And so there are nights where I kind of slept behind the shop, right, in my car, because the shop was like $1,000 a month. And I kind of made the trade-off. I'm like, look, it's just me. I'm young, no family. I'd rather just take friends or shower at my friend's house, or maybe, Mom, can I just come by for a day or so? I won't stay long. But I decided that I would actually pour my efforts into that shop and just building this business to sustain myself. And so the shop became a place where I spent a bunch of time, even when it was closed. And I remember my friend came by, his name is Ronnie Jordan, and he was like, look, I need a manager. And I'm like, doing the math, it's like, okay, a manager gets like a percentage of what you make. How much are they paying comedians these days? Well, it turns out when you first start out as a comedian,
That's low.
you're making like $25 to go do 30 minutes at a comedy club. And I'm doing the math like, dude, that's like $2.50, maybe $3 if we round it up and take 15% off top. And I was like, listen, yeah, I'll try to help. But first, I just want to see if you're any good. And Atlanta's weird geography-wise.
Okay.
There's one part of the city that's a little, I don't know, you talked about Snoop Dogg and Nate Dogg and Warren G. There's a part of the town that's going to be like that, and that's going to be the audience.
Okay.
And that particular comedy club, if you're not funny,
they roast you.
You're getting booed in the first 30 seconds. You better start good. If you don't, you just need to, you will get booed off stage and it's over, and you will feel really terrible about you, yourself, and your comedy career. And he held it down in that crowd. I mean, this is like a tough crowd. And he did a good job. I'm sitting here, I was like, wow, he's actually funny. But then he had another show the same night, about an hour north. And this is a different part of town. This is more suburbia,
Yeah, chill.
mostly white people. I'm like, you cannot use the same jokes
Oh, the F
that
word
you use
that
in
much.
that comedy club. I don't know how this is going to work. And he just switched it up to perfection, and they laughed there too. I was like, wow, you are actually pretty good at this. And so while I was running that computer store, running this consultancy business, I had a partner in the consultancy business too. His name was Daryl Brown, and he did a lot of the service calls, and I kind of make sure I closed the deals in terms of getting new customers, of course, splitting the work, and also running the computer store. And I was managing this comedian. And while managing this comedian, you learn a lot about the entertainment business, how you get shows, how to charge for them. We used to travel, and we did this contest where they were looking for the next king of comedy. And so there was a big kind of comedy tour called Kings of Comedy. Steve Harvey, Bernie Mac, Cedric the Entertainer.
Wow.
And they had a whole movie on TV. And the person who put that on, his name was Walter Latham. And he decided that he would have a reality show, because reality shows were really big at that time, or maybe starting to die off a little bit. But he was going to do a reality
the
show.
MTV era, maybe.
Yeah, the MTV era. Maybe a little after that. I mean, it's 2000. Now it's around 2002, 2003-ish. And they're going to do this 16-city tour.
Gotcha.
And my comedian got picked to be in the tour. And so we had this strategy because they were paying, I don't know, let's call it $500 every night if you pass each city. And I was like, look, all we got to do is not get voted off the island in the first couple of cities, and we'll make more money than you've ever made doing comedy.
There you go.
And we used to talk on the phone every night about what jokes to tell in what order. You start with 3 minutes and you work your way up to 7. And I remember he made it all the way to the last stage, 16 cities, New York, Madison Square Garden. They're doing arenas. And I remember flying to New York and sitting with all these other stars in hip hop. You know, Little Kim was in the audience.
Wow.
Chris Rock was there. There's so many celebrities in this thing.
Damn.
And I watched my comedian win.
Did
Won
he?
$35,000 grand prize.
So sick.
I took my cut. I'm still running the shop. I'm also doing IT services for Latham Entertainment. And because one thing that I noticed is that the opportunity is never predictable. We were in a hotel after that competition, and they were doing this hotel because they were doing, when you kick off a tour, they had live performers. Earth, Wind & Fire was one of the bands, the Isley Brothers, and some other comedians.
Nice.
And we were in this hotel, and he was trying to pull up his deck to show people the layout, the number of cities, the tours, and his internet wasn't working. And the hotel staff came in trying to, refresh the IP address, do whatever it takes to get him online. And I'm sitting there, only known as the manager to this comedian who had just won this tour. And I was like, hey, let me try. And they're looking at me like, what you finna do?
You're
Like,
a business guy.
you're the comedian manager guy. What do you know about technology? So I get him online, and he was like, hey, I need someone like you around at all times, on this tour especially. And I helped them redo their website and get video online. It was a lot going on, but I remember it's the first time I got a real salary for doing this tech work. I think they gave me like $70,000 a year.
Wow.
On top of the business I was running, on top of the money I was making managing this comedian. And so I got to a point now where I could have the shop and get my own apartment. And so things changed radically. But the biggest thing I remember, though, is when you go on the road with entertainers, a lot of money gets spent at the nightclub. A lot of money gets spent buying jewelry to impress other people.
You bet.
And a lot of those people go broke over time. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that I was concerned about when I was managing the comedian was I don't want them to go broke, making bad financial decisions. Here I was running this kind of computer consultancy, this computer store where the numbers matter, and we're kind of building for the long term. I was always business-minded about where the money was going. And so for me, I decided to become a minimalist because I think I started to fall into the trap. I was buying a new car. I was buying fancy clothes. I cared way too much about what people thought. And so I got rid of the car. I got rid of all the fancy things. And so a lot of my friends at that time saw this transition. They're like, what are you doing? Why are you kind of living to the minimum like this? And I let people know my philosophy at that time was I need to be more important than the things that I'm buying or wearing. And so if you ask my friends, who am I? They'll know that that's a core tenet of my philosophy to anything. So when people see me 25 years after that. And they see me working in open source. They see me working on Kubernetes. They see me doing all of these things. I'm definitely a human-centric person because I know how hard any of these jobs are because I had them in various forms throughout my career. I understand the danger of a hype cycle and the need for reality and education. And so I always brought that entrepreneurial mindset to anything, whether it was introducing a new technology to the world or leveraging that technology to build products, whether I was working at a small startup like CoreOS or a big cloud provider like Google Cloud. But it's definitely the human piece comes first. And if you ever met me in person, I think some people got to experience that. So I am not any of your favorite HR titles. I'm just a person who happens to be able to leverage technology to make things work. And I found this passion in educating other people so they can do the same.
Gotcha. If I'm becoming a comedian one day, maybe I'll call you. Just kidding. That's super nice. Really interesting to know more about you. All right. So with all this, now that I got to know a bit more, and with all the accomplishment in your insane career, what did it take on hindsight? Was it skills, talent, hard work, luck, or all of them together? Obviously, we all know success is relative, right? So go ahead.
No, it's relative. I think a lot of times at different phases of my career, the first phase is like just be accepted by the industry. Hope that you get hired, or maybe you start a business that people want to pay for. And so I would definitely say the first phase was just getting accepted, getting that A+ certification so I can be certified, getting hired at a place so I can be a Linux system administrator. And so I think that first phase of my career was just being accepted by the industry and earn a living just like everyone else. Then eventually, especially when I got into open source, I would say maybe year 5, no more computer store. Now I'm working in regular enterprises and different companies like this. And I realized that the tools we were using, especially when open source became even more prevalent, people got rid of like Solaris and started moving to Linux. People were using tools like Python. And then behind those communities, one thing I realized that when I ran into an issue or a bug, I can just go and contribute the fix. And that's when my calculus kind of changed. I went from hoping to just get a job to being able to say, yo, I can decide how this stuff actually works. I can contribute new features. I can take my ideas and not only just solve the problems that I have at the one company, I can actually contribute them upstream, and then it's something that impacts everyone. And I remember going to my first Python conference in Atlanta. PyCon came to Atlanta, and it was a huge conference at that time. And I remember after watching all of the talks and seeing people on the big stage, think about this. I'm looking on this stage, and these are the people behind the tools I'm using. And so I'm super fascinated, like, wow, I use these tools every day. These are the people behind these tools. And I was just interested in how they think about things, their approach to things, and why they seem to be so ahead of everyone else. And then afterwards, they had a hackathon. At that time, I was contributing to a tool called Virtual Int, so you can have virtual Python environments, and the PyPy infrastructure. And so for me, I was like, yo, I'm contributing these tools because we use them at work. And also there was a lot of friction in the Python community about what's the best way forward for packaging technologies. And these two things started to win, but they needed contributions. So I started to contribute nights and weekends. And that post-conference hackathon, everyone was there, just being super helpful. Guido van Rossum, the guy that invented Python, was there. All the people managing Python infrastructure. I made a few new friends. They were showing me the ropes, showing me details, and we were just getting things done. I'm like, wow, look at this. People from around the world come one place, common goal, and they just get things done. And when I saw that model, I think every team that I joined after that, to me, there was always a way to get to yes. Either the tools existed, we just needed to find them and we could use them, or the tools didn't exist and we could make them. And that became my persona, can-do attitude. I was never confined anymore by the HR hierarchy. It just didn't matter to me anymore because I already seen what is totally possible. And so once that bit got flipped, that's when I was like, okay, now I'm in the right trajectory. And I think that was kind of the big pivotal turning point in my tech career. And then after that, it set the stage for joining companies like Puppet Labs, joining companies like CoreOS, working at places like Google. But the common thread behind the scenes is this open source work. Anytime I thought that the industry should be going in a certain direction, I can launch a prototype and make it exist, or I can contribute the missing functionality in an existing product. And the last thing I learned was how to communicate those ideas. And so a lot of people get confused. They think, oh, you're speaking at conferences, you don't have technical skills. These things are somewhat related, but unrelated big time. The best thing you can do is probably learn how to leverage the most powerful programming language known to man, which is spoken language. Mm-hmm. We give people instructions, we transfer ideas from the past to the future, and people haven't learned how to command that particular tool set. They only rely on the one that allows you to talk to the machine. But the things we build are for actual people. And when I learn how to talk about technology, as it relates to your everyday job, that's the thing that I think people that know me from the Kubernetes community, they see the full package that came together, but that only comes together after like 20 years of all the other stuff being combined.
So it's not being visible as much as doing the work that matters?
When you do the work and you're visible, it creates this weird combination for luck to occur. Now, I'm going to walk back from towards the end of my career. I remember when I started doing a lot of these technical sessions, right? You go to a conference, they have the keynotes, and then they have those smaller sessions, right? The breakout sessions. And everyone would call me, hey, Kelsey, come and do a breakout session. And I was like, yeah, 100%. And I was always there. But eventually one day I said, listen, I'm not doing any more breakout sessions, keynote only. I need to only be on the main stage. No main stage. I'm ready to level up. I think I can do more than just technical demos. And when you communicate that, you're kind of signaling to the world what the new deal is. Mm-hmm. And then once people can see you, they say, hey, whether you believe I'm a keynote speaker or not is beside the point. I'm telling you, I'm only doing keynotes. Now, the other part of that equation is that I have to prepare myself to be able to do keynotes that are worth watching or that are compelling.
True.
But on the other side of that equation, this is where the luck starts, right? You tweet something like that, you don't know who's going to see it. You don't know who's running the conference. And I remember just maybe 4 years ago, there was a Python event in Portland, Oregon. And the same person that I met doing my first meetup at the local Python meetup in Atlanta, he was the chair for PyCon. And guess what? He invited me to give the closing keynote to PyCon, right? And I watched the whole thing come full circle at that time.
Full circle, yeah.
So I just think you definitely have to put yourself out there. You have to be definitely having the skills. But I think when you start to communicate to people where you're going, that's where a lot of the external opportunities have a better way of finding you.
Word. All right, now a bit of tech since it's called Tech Beats. You have been the top CNCF ambassador since 2016, I believe. But I always remember one of your old tweets showing the landscape of CNCF with the caption, "How did we get there?" Is it a good or bad thing? Like, and where does the adopter, like community or organization, stand in this ecosystem?
Yeah, so it's a good thing that we have all these people being creative, creating the world that they want to see. That is without a doubt a good thing. We want people all around the world with the ability to build these kind of tools, because a lot of these tools are actually being built on experience, and they're being built in a way that kind of fills a gap from what exists already. I'm going to always kind of lean on, this is probably a net good thing. The part, though, where you're a practitioner, right? I think sometimes we forget what the job actually is. If you're doing system administration or DevOps or SRE or platform engineering, whatever you want to call it, you're at a company, and let's just say the thing you work on is to help the company ship software. So let's just be very clear about what we're talking about. If you were doing this for, let's say, an iOS app, and your target is 100 million iPhones around the world, the loop for that is you can use Xcode. You write your application, you build your experience, you test it in that simulator, maybe you test it locally, and then use the build tools in Xcode to create a signed binary, ideally using your developer account from Apple, and you put it in the App Store. If you conform to the template, right, you have a few images, what it's about, you ask for permissions if your thing needs to use the camera or write to disk, you got to ask for those things. And then your code gets reviewed, and then once it's done, that thing can be distributed to 100 million devices around the world at different times, and no DevOps is involved. Now, Apple definitely has engineers that run the App Store. There are definitely people doing this kind of work behind the scenes. But you as a developer, when you're writing that mobile app, you are not trying to figure out whether they're using Kubernetes or not. It's not important. The thing that I see go wrong, whether it's been personal experience, I've been also guilty of doing this, or people that are so excited about all those little pieces in the landscape, they believe that managing those pieces is the job. So what they do is they go get Kubernetes, they install it from scratch because they want the badge of honor. Then they go get Prometheus and they put it in the cluster. They go get Nginx and they go put it in the cluster. Ingress controller in the cluster. Certificate manager in the cluster. And before you know, they have 50 different projects running in this thing. And you say, okay, what are you building? And it's like, oh, we're doing some cloud native thing. And you say, okay, what does a developer need to do? Oh, the developer. Well, we want to make sure that we're doing DevOps. So now they got to learn Terraform, YAML, all of these things. It's just noise. It is very far away from the iOS example I just gave.
True.
Because at the end of the day, if you rewind the clock even 15 years ago, the best experience, developer writes their code, you check it into a repository. Maybe they give you some hints about what this app needs, right? Maybe there's some routes that you need to publish, some security settings, some credentials that are required, whatever. And just from that semantic information, we as platform engineers, we should be able to use whatever collection of tools necessary to automate the process of getting that code built and distributed behind some endpoint so that users can use it. That's it.
Transparently.
This part where we start leaking all of these details about all of these different stacks, that's going the wrong way. And through sheer brute force, we've made it work. We've made it work, right? We have all these people on call. We have people learning YAML files, learning all of these different tools. And given the fact that we have enough of them and these companies have enough money to pull it off, we make it work. But it doesn't mean it's a good idea. And I think the thing that we have to realize in our industry is that we're trying to build a platform, maybe one that's a bit flexible to be able to do most of the things that your company's trying to do. And if we're being honest, it's almost impossible to keep pace with anything that they would want to do.
You bet.
And I think the allergic reaction we have is that what are the restraints that you're going to put in place so you can keep up? Apple has a list of rules which you can and cannot break in order to make this thing scale. And I think where we all struggle in this work is defining what those boundaries are that are not too restrictive that the team can't imagine and build great experience for the customers, but not too open where it's impossible to manage without making everyone be exposed to all the low-level tools.
Got it. My next question is about the monolith vs microservice all debate. That's maybe overcooked by now, but is it still a thing in 2023? I'm thinking of two recent examples that made noise lately, being first, the Stack Overflow monolith model that serves all the traffic with only 9 on-premise web servers, and it's a full monolith. And the second one is success story of Prime Video tech teams switching from serverless to monolith. So what's your take on this?
So I want to make sure I give a little bit of context here. The context I'm coming from is someone who has been a system administrator for a good part of my career, trying to manage all this stuff in production, being on call, using alerts to try to deal with things, waking up in the middle of the night to a service you've never seen before, have no idea how it works, and you're expected to just make it better or fix what's wrong. And also as a developer, that when you join a company, you don't always get to start over. You typically use what's already there. If it's a Java shop, you're probably going to learn Java, if you don't know it already, in order to contribute. And a lot of these companies are not writing all their code from scratch. And so there's a lot of built up cruft decision-making, responses to bugs, vulnerabilities, last-minute changes. It all gets piled up in the code base somewhere. And depending on the language that you're using and its ecosystem. So when I started in the early 2000s, I would say around 2006, when I was doing things, application servers were really popular. So things like JBoss, WebLogic, And in many ways, it kind of lent itself to this kind of monolithic software development paradigm where the application server provided things like HTTP proxies, SSL termination, authorization layer, connections to your database. And so as a developer, you just kind of wrote whatever the domain was. So if you were doing payments and you were taking credit card transactions, then that binary you were working on, it kind of focused on that. And things were kind of domain driven. So if you were about logging people in, maybe your binary did everything around logins. And then over time, as the team introduced new login methods, you would just keep adding it to the thing you had. So even if you started off with this really clean domain model, it started to get crufty over time, right? Because now it takes too long to authenticate a user by going over the network, calling that service, and then coming back. And so sometimes if you want to respond to that because your load has gone up, we may move that off service to the same binary or the same application server as the rest of the app to cut down on all the network calls. And so you did what was necessary. I think now that people kind of zoom out and try to pre-optimize for this pattern, this is where I think the mistakes start to show up. When you say microservices by default, there are some people who really believe this. You should start by trying to understand almost the entire call stack. You have a web front end. The funny thing about this is no matter how much microservices you have at the back, there's probably like one domain name that glues it all together with this monolithic UI. So from the user's perspective, they can't really tell the difference.
Definitely.
You're gonna have to surface all these features and functionality somewhere, but they just keep going with this model. And so in this case, you feel like, look, I'm just gonna assume the network's gonna be reliable. I'm going to serialize and deserialize and encrypt traffic between all of the pieces in this call stack. At a small scale, it probably doesn't even matter. Even if it's a bad idea, it just doesn't matter. The same is true, though, for monolithic code. If you just have a small team of people and you all kind of know what you're doing, you know how to work together and not step on each other's toes, you know how to merge things, then you can probably also get away with a monolithic application. But I think what we're learning in reality is that modular code has probably been the most overlooked component of all of this. Like when you pick up a programming language, the standard library is over here, usually divided in very clean modules and packages. Third-party modules and packages are kind of standalone things, and you import them as you need them. People that write code that way too, even for their own private services, then they usually have less of an issue deciding between monolith and microservice. Because if we're writing all of our code modularly, and then at build time, we decide whether we have one big binary that just imports all the packages and wires them up underneath some HTTP interface, or creating one binary for each of the modules, it doesn't make a big difference in the grand scheme of things for most people. And we have so much evidence that if you're GitHub or Stack Overflow, you can have 3 or 4 monoliths service millions and millions and millions of users easily, especially now. These servers are big. Memory is plentiful for many of these applications. There's so many design patterns that I think any of these models would work. And so to me, I'm kind of left with this idea that microservices really do make sense in a case where, a team wants full autonomy on what they're doing. And so if you are Spotify, for example, one team may be in charge of the song catalog. And they have a song catalog service, and maybe there's 50 people who work on that. That team may decide that they need 4 binaries to make that service work, so they can split the work amongst each other and work independently of each other with very few clashes and just make promises around the API. And they may implement that as a collection of 4 different services. But then this other team that's actually doing playlist management, they may decide that, look, we're good with the Ruby on Rails monolith. We really don't need all of that. We just want a high performance thing that we can just scale horizontally. And all it does is provide playlist stuff. All of these things can now integrate with each other, but we don't need to care that they all go into one big monolithic binary. Like that could be hard on that kind of design. So to me, I'm less religious about monoliths versus microservices, but I do think it makes sense to understand the true cost of serializing and communicating over a network, because it ain't free and is definitely not a best pattern that you should always do by default. But when it comes to breaking up domains and giving people autonomy on what programming language they use, there are cases where that makes sense. Sometimes everything is written in Ruby on Rails, but the thing you want to integrate with only has a Java SDK. In that case, you might want to write that component in Java and then have to wire everything back up over the network. And those cases do exist. So I don't know. I'm not really bullish on one or the other. It just doesn't matter as much to me. But you find me defending the monolith a lot more because people dismiss it as if it's like some kind of bad practice and that microservices are superior.
Yeah, it's like a dogma or something. Would you say decoupling begets microservice design?
It's the easiest way people can think about it in their minds. Because if I told you that you have to talk to this other service via HTTP, then you have no choice but to do a very hard, clean client-server split, because that's how the protocol forces you to think. And so if I told you, you have to do these as microservices, then you're forced to think client-server. And it's hard to violate contracts because HTTP, you literally have to make a request, and you have to get a response, and you have to deserialize it. And so you can almost enforce behavior by picking such a protocol or architecture. So I can see why people default to that. But when you say modular code, the way I think about this is that if you were to treat all of your services as like a package that must be imported, whether we're doing Lambda, serverless, whether we're doing a binary where everyone's going to import their code into the same entry point and then do like routing where, this path goes to this service. But either way, we're going to enforce the same discipline. Everything must be a module. So if I look at the top of your source code file, I should see import user service version 001, import database abstraction layer 002, import, business logic, blah, blah, blah. And so the import statement should look the same. Now the team says, you know what? We really need to do something different here because security reasons, we need a tighter decoupling than a monolithic binary can provide. We want encrypted memory. We want to only run this service in one geographical region in the entire world where everything else can run anywhere. And we think the easiest way to do that is not by flags and all this other stuff. We just want to create a separate binary to make it easier to impose these restrictions. But if I look at that code, I should see the same import statement. And I should see the same kind of wiring up that you would have done in the monolith to keep everything clean. And you can still kind of enforce this client architecture. I think when we write monoliths, I remember me getting lazy. I'm just like, you know what? I'm not going to go through the normal client interface. I'm just going to instantiate a class and do some meta programming and put my method right on top. And now we got spaghetti code. That's not good. So it's really hard to enforce discipline when you can just kind of reach behind the covers and violate the external interface by just reaching into the base class, using private methods, adding private methods just for your service. Like, you don't want to get into that. And so I get why people want these hard boundaries. So I think if you just start by saying, let's just treat all of our business logic, all these different domains as independent version packages. And then when we import them, we got to make sure that we have a clean client interface. So if you're listening to this and you're like, well, we're just doing a bunch of object-oriented programming, then what you have to think about is, think about all the things you do when HTTP gets involved, right? You take your base class, you instantiate it, but then you have to put it behind an interface that takes in the request, deserializes the parameters, and then calls the business logic. You also have to produce a client kind of interface as well, like service.newClient. And then that new client gives you an interface to that same object. And yeah, it feels a little bit more tedious, but I think this is how we keep our code clean and modular.
Gotcha. We're not done with debates because I had another one for you, but more about the human part of it. What do you think about the platform engineering vs DevOps fuss? What's that all about? Like, is it, is one replacing the other, or is just semantics here?
Yeah, I mean, I think people that are really good at what they do in this space, they don't really care what the name is. I think when the people are more confused, they need these names almost like crutches, right? Because think about it. If someone told you you're responsible for making sure that development team has a clean, reliable deployment target, and so you would say, you would just draw a line on the whiteboard. What is a deployment target? Where does it start? Maybe it's at the end of your CI/CD pipeline. So you say, great, our team's responsibility starts here, and it backs up on the other side of this line. So we take care of the Linux servers, we take care of the load balancers, IAM, cloud, VPC. That's us because it's in our bucket. And so we're going to use different sets of tools to make that work. Sometimes we may choose a PaaS, like, hey, we don't really need all these layers. We're just going to use something like, I don't know, Cloud Run or Heroku. Or we do need these layers, so we're going to bring in, low-level infrastructure like IaaS, VMs, Kubernetes for containers, you name it. But I think if you understand the area of responsibility, then you kind of know what's in your domain. Now, as a professional, you ask yourself, what tools will help me fulfill that contract, right? Like take care of my things, get the highest SLA possible. Now, you can turn to different communities and say, how do you do it? Mm-hmm. And these could be people also doing the work. Some people find that easier to say, what do the DevOps people do? What do the platform engineers do? You could do that if you want, but I think if you tuck those names away, the responsibility remains. And sometimes I think people don't really want to know the actual answer, right? Because it involves hard work, it involves detailed planning, it involves real skills. And so instead of getting those and focus on those, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes people take the lazy way out and they just say, we're doing DevOps. And you say, how long have you been doing DevOps? Oh, we've been doing DevOps for 10 years. And you still struggling with CI/CD? You still struggling with like how to get software from binary to the server? Like, I don't know, man. I think you're talking about DevOps a lot and you're not really figuring out what skill set, people, strategy you actually need. You keep trying to find silver bullets. You're trying to buy this product because you think it's going to solve all the DevOps checkboxes. You're adopting these names as if, you can imagine playing soccer and you're like, hey, we're world champions. Like, no. You're not world champions. You actually have to win.
Yeah.
Before you just start adding titles to the team, right? You can practice, you can play, you can try to build a better team, but you just can't just rub a title on the team and consider that success. And I think I see a little bit too much of that where people are just saying we're doing a thing without the accountability and without the results.
It's like more like a PowerPoint warriors than in the field, I guess.
Yeah, because I think the work, at least through my career, it's always been the same kind of work. Even the people what people call platform engineering now, and I hope that the new wording, platform engineering, helps people realize that we got to do more than just install Terraform and teach people how to write HCL. Mm-hmm. Maybe as a platform engineer, you start to have more of a product mindset. What product are we building? What experience do we want to give our developers so they can actually ship code as fast as possible? And it's always going to be this trailing indicator. So if you start on day 0, you may have to start with like Kubernetes and asking people to write YAML files. But once you see the YAML files that people are writing, maybe day 2 looks a little bit like we're going to use a Helm chart to create templates so you don't have to worry about the low-level details. Maybe on day 3, you start to say, we don't even need people to even know we're using Helm. We can just tell from a little bit of metadata next to the app what it needs. And the fact that we're using Kubernetes or not doesn't even matter anymore. But I think as a platform engineer, you got to put on that product hat to keep evolving your product. And sometimes the work you do will probably just be the gray area between what a cloud provider has, whether it's like Heroku or Lambda, and the bit of glue that you need to make it work for your particular company. I think as a platform engineer, you need to be prepared sometimes to build it from scratch, from VM up, or just to take an existing platform and then just provide enough of that glue so that it actually works for your team.
Makes sense. Right on. My next one is, at what time serverless stops making sense? I mean, not just cost-wise or process length, but in terms of a paradigm or logic.
The thing is, I think you know when the time comes. Like, so for example, let's say you don't have any customers, right? You got a new project, no customers, no traffic. Your team is just kind of building out the idea. And at that point, you probably want to invest in infrastructure as little as possible so you can get to the point where this thing is ready for like customers or to be used by someone. And so let's just do something concrete. Let's go back to like a catalog service. What songs do you have? And then how long are the songs? What's the artwork? Who the artist is? Let's say that's the app you're building. So if it was me, I'm like, okay, let's just put all the songs in an S3 bucket. I don't know, we got 100 songs, put them in S3 bucket. And then we're going to expose metadata about those songs through an API. And if we're on Amazon, maybe we use Amazon Lambda. Maybe you like containers, so you go with App Runner or ECS. Doesn't matter. You just try to pick the one that's not going to demand so much of your time. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to go make a very simple CI/CD process. Check in the code, build binary, and we just put it to Lambda, update the URL, and we're done, right? And you just keep working on the code, okay? Now you start to get some customers. People are like, hey, we like that service, and we want to use it. And you look at it, and it's like, I don't know, 1 request per second. It doesn't matter at this point what you picked. If you're doing this with Lambda, it's going to be fine. It actually even may be cheaper, 1 request per second, just to use Lambda. You can actually just do the math. 1 request per second times the pricing for Lambda, link to the transaction. Here's exactly what it costs. Leave it alone. You're done. Now, the same people want you to actually compress the song when you upload it to the catalog. And you find out that Lambda gets really expensive if the thing sticks around for a long time. The unit price for CPU time is way out of whack compared to a VM. So now you're at the crossroad as a team. You say, look, Lambda got us real far for the majority of this service. Now, the part where people upload music to us to the new catalog and they want us to compress it into 5 different pieces, how should we do it? You know, you might say, you know what, we can keep using Lambda to take the request, stick it in the message queue, and use a VM to do the actual compression. So yeah, you know what, that's smart. So we keep using Lambda as a front end, no need to change all of that. We can re-architect the request and then use a background VM to do the long-running compression work. No problem. So in that case, it's serverless and a VM for parts of it. Now you might get to a point where the cost structure starts to be like, look, if we're going to maintain all these VMs, we might as well just move it all to VMs. And that might actually be the right decisions, but I think as an engineer, you should be able to craft that math and say, you know what, this can totally work, because we're really just talking about how this thing gets invoked and how it runs. So that's the way I would do it. So I don't think there's like this, always start with serverless. I think having an app that could run serverless is, to me, a sign of good design. Like our business logic is broken up in a modular way, like we talked about earlier, that I can import that business logic in a Lambda function, use a Lambda wrapper to, bring in the request, deconstruct it and call the same business logic. But then when the time comes, I can take the same business logic and put it behind a normal, always running web server and still have it work. I think that's actually pretty good design. So make sure that your app can work in both worlds. And if you're going to close one off, there should be a real concrete engineering reason why we never want this to work in a serverless environment.
Nice. Yeah, it's like not burning the bridge. Keep the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I think good architecture allows you to have as many bridges as you need.
Interesting. Okay. Now, you are one of the pioneers of Kubernetes, right? Everybody knows that. Yet you claimed yourself, this was in Germany, I believe, that one day Kubernetes will die and the replacement is maybe already here. What does life after Kubernetes look like?
Yeah, so I think if you're a technologist, then you would like to see progress. And so to me, what Kubernetes represents, it represents a checkpoint on everything we learned up until around 2015. That's what Kubernetes kind of represents. Some people would say it represents everything we learned up until like 2010. We know that you can have lots of computers participate in a distributed system. You can use a controller, scheduler to try to efficiently use all of that compute. We've learned that a long time ago. I think Docker gave us a set of primitives in which to build upon for the average person that's not at Facebook or Google. So you take Kubernetes and everything you learn from Puppet, Chef, and Ansible around configuration management. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of that Kubernetes manifests this idea of declarative configuration and then having a reconciler go and make it true. These things people used to experiment with in the early days of Puppet and Chef, just a different dialect, right? Instead of infrastructure as code, Ruby or Python or whatever your dialect was, Kubernetes makes it a little bit more official by saying it has to be data infrastructure as data. But the same control loops are kind of there, looking at the current state of the world and then reconciling it to be the desired state. That's an old concept that the world was ready for, in my opinion, only because Puppet, Chef, Ansible, those tools existed first. It wasn't a brand new concept to us. Maybe the dialect was different, but the workflow was somewhat similar. And so when you get Kubernetes with that kind of lens, you look at it as like a checkpoint of everything we know finally manifested into one system that most people found a little easier to use because of Docker and the way it worked. We already had this existing content. People were already making container images, the price of admission to Kubernetes. So Kubernetes lays on top. Now, the thing that's interesting about Kubernetes that I think a lot of people may not understand until they use it for a while is the same thing that makes HTTP interesting. If you look at HTTP through the lens of Nginx or Apache, all you see is a web server and a protocol for a browser to communicate to a web server and send information back and forth, right? That's the simplistic way to think about HTTP.
Yeah.
But if you take the protocol away from the web server and you use it as a common protocol, you can now talk to databases like MongoDB. You can now implement things like gRPC, where you have a bidirectional stream of messages going back and forth. And you have something that now just works across the internet, even when no traditional web server is involved, even when no traditional web browser is involved. So in many ways, HTTP has already outlived the initial roots in like a web server serving HTTP to some web browser. It's used for so many other things, still client-server architecture because of the nature of the protocol. So if you take the Kubernetes style API, we go from Terraform, Pulumi, and the way you build infrastructure today, you kind of think about like a RESTful interface, right? Where if you want to create a VM, you can have people make 500 calls, right? Create a network, create a VPC, attach the VM to the VPC. Once it's ready, install the operating system, mount a volume, and do all of these things. Yeah. And that could be 5 different API calls. So if you actually look at a Terraform provider, you'll see some of them are actually calling multiple calls just to create one unit of compute. In the Kubernetes model, it's a little cleaner than that. It has 2 things that are important. It has a spec and it has a status field. And that status field is so powerful because it really helps you do this fully declarative thing. So you can say, give me a VM. I would like it to be in this VPC. Maybe you reference an existing VPC. You can say, I want it to have this much CPU memory. You get the idea. And so that object, now we give infrastructure a type system. And this concrete type, you can, when you first get the object, even if there's no code to process it, you can always say in the status field, this thing doesn't exist and no one's even looked at it yet. And then, even if you're not using Kubernetes, you can take that same declarative model and start to build a control plane that allows people to say, I would like the lights to turn on if you really want to do that. Or I would like to have this app running in Germany and Australia, but never the US. And you can give it that manifest, and then the status field can say, hey, Germany is done working on Australia. Verified, there's nothing in the US. Verified, there's nothing in the US. Your spec is still good. That's very powerful because then you can start to do pipelines. You can now have emission hooks that say, I'm looking at what you requested and it no longer lines up with the policy. So now I'm going to change the declaration to match the policy, show you the diff, you can accept it, and then all the other control loops reconcile the world. That Kubernetes model to me will probably outlive Kubernetes as it should. And then we should get better implementations, right? Where if you want to do like edge processing, but you like that API, do you really need the entire Kubernetes stack? This thing like needs like a gig or more to just run on a node? Or could we get by with something that runs in a few megabytes that looks and feels like Kubernetes? And then long term, as people keep coming up with better types, you're going to get a type that's going to be like, run this app globally. And it won't even mention a cluster or a namespace or a zone. And so as you get this new type, maybe the current implementation of Kubernetes won't be able to handle a global service. You have to build something different. And that's what I mean by over time it goes away. Not saying that it's not important. Like even though we talk about Kubernetes a lot these days, right there is Linux. sitting there 30 years later, still doing its job.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by we need it to go away so that something new can come in its place and maybe borrow parts that are worth preserving going forward. But if we're still doing little Kubernetes clusters for the next 30 years, what the hell happened?
So Kubernetes is maybe the HTTP of tomorrow?
I think the Kubernetes API has kind of proven itself for those that know how to use it, that its API model is really, really nice because of the way it splits the concerns between the person that wants something and the responsibility of the thing that does it. So instead of a cloud provider like Amazon or Google or Azure making you call 5 different endpoints just to get a VM, maybe we can move to a world where you just say, I would like a VM with these specs, and let them handle the implementation details. And you can just delete one object or create one object. And I think that's the big game changer. We don't have that today. So if that becomes a new foundation in which we design these cloud-like APIs, I just think we just move in a better space and no Kubernetes cluster required to do that.
Interesting. Okay, now I want you to help me understand what the heck is service mesh and Istio? And is it a hype that's a remixed version of something that existed in the past? And is eBPF here to replace it? You know, like we get into replace things that are fresh, not even mature yet.
Yeah, I think the thing that helps you kind of understand what a service mesh is if you think about like data center. You know, if you got a data center, you know, you need some power, you need internet access, you need some physical racks. And then you decide that, look, in my data center, I'm going to use Cisco for the router, maybe Cisco for the switches. I need some storage, so I go get EMC. And I also want some compute, so I'll just go buy some Dell servers and put Linux on it. You might even Pixie boot it, and you have all this infrastructure, right? And you might have a bunch of scripts that you've run for each of the layers of the stack. And they all are managed slightly differently, but maybe they're all automatable. So that works. And so when you think about that, though, you're just like, yeah, just data center. I do data center technician. I know how to rack and stack these servers, and I know how to manage them. But imagine if you put a control plane on top of the same stack, then you call it cloud. And then all the stuff on the rack becomes the data plane, and the cloud UI, the API becomes the control plane. So once you have these two things, it's almost worthy of a new name because of the interaction model. We just treat the data plane as a unified surface, and then we kind of have a more complete, and it feels like a unified API, so much so that you can use tools like Pulumi and Terraform to drive them. But it's underneath the hood, we know it's roughly the same fundamentals, right? There's servers and kernels and power and networking.
Sure.
When it comes to service mesh, the same thing has happened over the last 20 years. You start with, I need networking. Great. So there's still layer 2, layer 3, layer 4. And I think when it comes to layer 2 and 3, I think the world has kind of decided that we can get really far with abstraction. So whether it's a VLAN using something like VMware or as a VPC like in cloud provider. And in many cases, layer 2 and layer 3, for most people, it's kind of figured out. I have an IP and I can ping the other thing and it gets there. All right, we're good. Most people don't want to deal with static routes anymore. We're good. And so what's left in that equation? Well, layer 4 and above. So layer 4 through 7, TCP IP, UDP. If you have a DNS server, it's probably going to get exposed through UDP. And so you got to put that thing, give it an IP address, and then you put a domain on it. And if you get a domain, then people can do lookups against your DNS server. If you have layer 7, of course, same thing. Go get an Nginx, Apache, and you can put a domain on top, and then people can talk HTTP. But again, we're back in that old data center model. A bunch of networking services all being exposed through random ports, random domain names, and the config for DNS is very different than the config for Nginx, is very different from the config from Apache. They're there, so you just make it work. But what happens when you put a control plane on that layer? When you put a control plane on that layer, it becomes a little different. First thing you try to do is figure out what is a common API. How do I articulate to the system that these two endpoints should be talking MTLS? I know how to do that with Nginx. I go get 2 certificate pairs, I put them on both sides, and I tell the Nginx configuration to do MTLS. And then I have to tell Nginx or Apache a different way. But if you're Istio and you put a control plane on top, you're trying to now to find a common way to express MTLS, network routes, L4 versus L7, things like permissions. This endpoint cannot talk to this endpoint. All those things were possible before. You can literally not use service mesh and pretty much do everything that a service mesh does with technology from probably 10 to 15 years ago. Guaranteed you could probably do it. You may need some like Nginx extension to make it work, but you totally could. So to me, when I hear service mesh, now what we're trying to do is formalize these network layers into a control plane, data plane split. So instead of thinking about Nginx as one layer, TLS encryption as another layer, we can unify them. Now, did this work in practice? That's the problem. I don't know if it worked in practice because there's also a bit of service discovery, which means you have to integrate with things like Kubernetes or some other tool like Console. And so what I think the world has discovered is that Istio in its current form is pretty heavy, especially the way people tried to roll it out. The thing that makes service mesh interesting is that you need something to hang all of these configurations off of. And the service mesh community decided to do it via identity. So when you write that playlist service, maybe your playlist identity is a token that identifies it as the playlist service. And then you get this token. Now, if I want to have very curated sets of rules and not to make things too complicated, people have this idea that you can just put the load balancer right next to the app. And so for every app deployment, you got this sidecar service mesh deployment. And so if your app was using 8 gigs of RAM and a sidecar also wanted 8 gigs of RAM, now you got 16 gigs of RAM just to run the same service. Some people, they thought the trade-off was worth it. For some people, that's too high of a cost to pay. And so I think the service mesh idea was a good one, data planes and control planes. Now the discussion is, where should the control plane or where should the data plane live? And now you've been hearing things like ambient mesh, where people are saying, hey, maybe we don't need sidecars by default. There's a lot you can do without putting one web server next to every process. You could actually just put one load balancer for the entire cluster and still give it that service mesh feel. And so I think people are revisiting. But to me, when I think about service mesh, it's about unifying the data plane to have a common command and control interface and a control plane that lets you do it.
Interesting. Because it was very confusing even for me, like the ambient mesh vs the original service mesh. And now with the BPF, they're talking about having everything running at kernel level of your node instead of having sidecars.
And I just think about that as a data plane. So the original Istio data plane is Envoy.
Okay.
You take Envoy, you put it next to your app, and then Envoy has all of these features. You just got to tell it what to do. So from a control plane, you push down to all the envoys what the rules are. And then Envoy it can be heavy. You need to deploy it, you need to manage it. And so if you were to change the data plane instead of one per app, so that means on one host, you might have 10 containers on there with 10 copies of Envoy.
Yeah.
People say that's insane. Like that, why is that the default case? So then you say, well, where could we move the data plane? Well, you could say, let's just take the same Envoy binary and just put one per host.
Yeah.
And then we can kind of configure it that way like we used to do with like one Nginx for the whole cluster. And then when we start to talk about eBPF, again, it may not be able to do everything that Envoy can do. So let's say all you care about is like basic observability, like what's happening, metrics, and you care about TLS mutual auth. Well, those two things you could probably do with a very small data plane. So if those are the only features, let's call that 2 out of 10 service mesh features, then do I really need a heavy data plane? No, I can start with eBPF. Maybe there's some value, maybe it goes faster, easier to manage, who knows? But either way, I can start with that data plane. But if there's features you want to do that requires a more sophisticated data plane, then you can bring back the Envoy binary. So that's how I try to keep this stuff sane. Data planes and control planes, and use the data plane that gives you the functionality that you need.
Interesting. Thanks for clarifying that for me. Now let's talk about dev's consumerism. Are we in a disposable dev language era? I want to make a dent to that problem, actually. Suppose I'm a new dev should I choose monthly hype or stick to my guns? Now that we have like different languages, different APIs, runtime environments, especially when they say most important isn't how we write code, but focus on building experience for customers. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, so if you put software to the side for just a second, let's say you do construction work and your specialty is drywall, right? That's all you know how to do. You say, hey, do not call me until this house is ready for drywall. So that means you got to do all the electrical, all the plumbing, all the framing, and then I come in, all right? And then one day, the people who do the framing learn how to do drywall. They don't call you no more. Say, hey, man, why nobody calling me? Say, yeah, you know, we're so good at this framing thing that we decided that we're also going to learn how to do drywall. These new tools are really great. You know, we got these tools to cut them easy, to design it. We just said, we're already putting up the framing and, you know, we can just come back and do the drywall once the electrical is in. So we don't really call you anymore. We just learn how to do that too.
Yeah.
And you're like, damn, man, I better learn some new skills. So you might say, well, I'm going to learn how to do framing too. Now, when you look in your tool bag, when you were just doing drywall, you might have one of those kind of, you know, the knife so you can kind of cut the drywall and you can crack it.
I got it.
You might have had some mud tools so you can kind of fill in the holes and the seams. You might even had like a screwdriver so you can screw in the drywall screws. But that's all you had in your tool bag. It was kind of light.
Yeah, it's very light.
But now that you're doing framing, you're like, oh man, I got to go get me, you know, some tape measure stuff. I need to go get a skill saw. Your tool bag is getting bigger, right?
Big deal.
Now, the debate is, should you get like the Bosch skill saw or should you get the Deloitte? Like, which one should you get?
Gotcha.
Do you even care? Like some people say, man, it don't matter the skill saw, bro. Like most of these things are probably made by the same manufacturer anyway, right? They just got a different logo on them. Now, some do have features that a pro know how to use, like, you know, the automatic cutoff, it has a little light on it. So if you're cutting and there's not a lot of light in there, like there's different things professionals need. So you'll evaluate the different saws. But you also might need a table saw if you want to cut a bunch of wood real quick because you don't want to be sitting there doing these things. But I think as someone that wants to be as useful as possible on the construction site is going to learn to bring in as many things in their tool bag to help them be useful and relevant to the team of people building that particular structure. So let's get back to the software development. When you first start, to me as a software developer, the hardest thing to do is to pick a language.
Yeah.
And like, what do humans do when we're born? We take the language our parents have because that's the language you got to learn in order to survive in your environment so you can talk to your family. So we learn that language. That's the best language to learn. Learn the language in the country in which you're born in so you can survive. This is too easy. Yeah. There's a lot of languages in the world, but that one makes the most sense. So if I was a developer getting started, learning my first language, I'm going to look around and say, okay, if I live in a certain region of the world and I know that there are more jobs in Java, it just might make sense to learn Java. Not because Java is the best language, but it just kind of makes sense.
It's everywhere.
If you want to get a job there. Now, let's say you're writing Java all the time, and then people coming to you saying, hey, man, you got to learn Scala. You're like, why? It runs on a JVM. I don't see the reasons. Like, no, man. Everything's going to go Scala now or Kotlin. Yeah. This is the new way, better syntax. And you're sitting there like, yo, bro, I can do a lot with Java. I don't understand why people are getting so hyped up about this thing. And so you say, listen, to me, as someone I just want to look at my tool bag to just make sure I'm paying attention. I look and I say, well, what is this Kotlin thing? I look it up, and it turns out the Android people are really moving towards Kotlin more and more. And you're saying, okay, but I'm not doing Android apps.
Yeah.
But I understand where this push is coming from. Then I try to figure out, like, what is Kotlin allowing me to do that I can't do in the, with just plain old Java? And I try to make sure that I'm being honest with myself. Like, I try to learn. And I might run through a tutorial, but I'm not going to switch careers. I might say, you know what? I think I can write enough Kotlin. 70% of my Java skills apply because it still runs on JVM. The error logs look roughly the same. So look, maybe if when the time comes, I won't reject it. I'm not going to fight people that want to bring Kotlin into the team, but I also just be aware that it exists. And so to me, I always learn the tools of the job that I'm currently at. So let's say you switch companies, the company you're at goes IPO, you make a bunch of money, you decide to go do something else, and that team is doing Rust. Mm-hmm. You say, you know what? I don't really care about Rust versus Java, but this is the team I'm on, and if I want to be helpful, then I'm going to learn Rust and figure out how I can add that to my tool belt. That's my philosophy on these programming languages, because the way I think about them now is that they're just tools to talk to the computer. And if you're doing iOS programming, Swift may be the language for you because you're going to get the most support. That's where the ecosystem is going. So you should just learn Swift if you want to make your life as easy as possible to program for that particular output. And developers who can program for multiple domains, they have an easier time, evolving as times change. And so I would just say be flexible and, have some rhyme or reason to paying attention to what these things are. But nothing's wrong with expanding your tool belt in a responsible way.
I totally agree. But sometimes I feel the pain of the new developers, especially graduated one, when they want to apply for a job in their CVs and they have to put like so many languages in the list of, mastered language. And back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we didn't have that many languages that we need to keep up with VS right now, right?
I'll give a story for people that are finding themselves in that position. After that computer shop, I decided to go into just normal kind of corporate America. And I remember my first job I applied for was to be a data center technician at Google. I worked at lots of other jobs before coming back to Google several years later. But I remember they had all of these things that they wanted to see. It was like Linux system administration, Bash, C++, it would be helpful, lots of Python at the time. Mm-hmm. I didn't know Python. And at that time, I was learning FreeBSD because I was a big fan of the BSD way of thinking about the Unix philosophy. And so I just kind of looked at Linux as like, I'm just going to learn the original open Unix. So all of my knowledge was all about FreeBSD, everything I knew about it. So I'm in this interview, and luckily for me, a lot of the questions they were asking, a lot of the command line utilities kind of worked the same. I had already started using Bash, and I knew enough about system administration. But then he started asking Linux questions. And I was like, look, I don't know. I'm going to be honest with y'all. I don't know the Linux way of doing these things. I do understand the difference between userland and the kernel, but I don't know all these Linux specifics. And then luckily for me, I think maybe they asked or I prompted, but I do know a lot about FreeBSD. And boy, did I hit the jackpot. It turns out there were 3 interviewers on this panel. And one of the interviewers had the mascot for FreeBSD is called Beastie. He's like this little demon with this little thing. He had a tattoo on his leg.
Oh, man.
And I was like, yes. And he just switched to asking FreeBSD questions to cover the operating system part of the interview. And I think any good interviewer or someone that can like help map the skills, I think there's a way to demonstrate like, look, I chose C++ for these reasons. Here's the things I was able to build with C++. I know your team is doing Python, and here the difference, I know that they're different in these ways, but I promise I can learn Python. And here's my approach to learning new languages. And here's where I think C++ may even be helpful, right? Parts of the Python ecosystem integrate with things like libc and C libraries all the time. And I think my skills in C++, learning how to compile, run optimizations, may come in handy when we're doing this Python work. So I am fully prepared to learn. And I think that has to actually be kind of part of the interviewer process to say, hey, don't disqualify me because I wasn't able to perfectly pattern match. Like, you're hiring more than just like a C++ programmer. You're hiring a programmer. Give me a chance to learn.
Sure. So another question I have for you. How can we distinguish the right abstractions from the bloat abstractions? How do you pick the right abstraction in the IT realm?
So my pattern has always been, especially when I used to be an engineer at Puppet, before joining Puppet Labs, I worked in a financial institution for about 3 years. And the one process that I kind of developed there was I need to learn how to do it manually. So no abstraction, nor any automation. I just want to know what the individual steps are and ask people, are these the right steps that need to be performed? And they say, yeah, these are the exact steps that need to happen, and these are the right results. I say, great. Now, once I understand the process, then now I have a head start on the automation, right? Because I can just go and write most of this in Bash, maybe do some weird stuff that there's a GUI involved. But either way, I can automate the right process. And so once you automate the right process, then comes the interface. And like if you got a Bash script, maybe there is no real interface other than a very simple input, the thing you want to deploy. And there's like one input, one flag.
Sure.
But to me, that's automation. But I think abstraction goes a little bit further, right? I think abstraction is where we ask ourselves, should we just drag and drop a commit hash to a target server and just let it be this idea that there's now a new meta package, right? This tag, and you can deploy a tag. So now the tag becomes an abstraction for the software, and that tag being placed into a Kubernetes cluster can generate all the other things like manifest, YAML files, you name it. And so when I think about abstractions in that way, that's where it kind of gets interesting, because automation is a secondary concern. So then I'm thinking about what is the experience you want someone to have. So this idea of like containers or Git tags. So when you look at a tool like Heroku, Heroku represents to me a pretty good piece of abstraction, like a PaaS 12-factor app. It's trying to abstract the world into this common thing where you can just say, give me this tag or give me this source repository and I will turn it into a running service for you. Not automation, not run the script, not do these things. So I think there's a fine line between automation and abstraction. And Kubernetes also tries to demonstrate this in the very same way. Like when you say, hey, Kubernetes, I want you to deploy this container for me. Well, we know how to do that behind the scenes, like tell Docker to create a sandbox, wire up Linux namespaces and run something. But then what's the abstraction? The abstraction is a deployment object, right? A deployment can restart. It can roll out over time, but how you do that is very different. And so these abstractions, I think there's always this we're always chasing when to do which. And I think that where we go wrong as like platform engineers and system administrators, we go wrong when we start with the abstraction. Because sometimes we're abstracting the wrong thing. It's like, this process is not any good. So no matter if you make the really nice drag and drop web UI thing, the process is flawed. It's just wrong on the surface. So I think the thing that I've always found is that when people want to do something net new that you hadn't had a time to either automate or abstract away, you're going to see something like brute force. It's going to be really nasty. It's going to be ugly. You just want to go clean up that process first. Once you get the process clean, automate it, and then ask yourself, is there a way to introduce a new abstraction here to even hide the automation and only expose the things that are necessary to make it work?
Makes sense. Makes total sense. The next one is after the abstraction, I'm still trying to focus on the people at work. I heard you talk about something called empathetic engineer, or how to instill empathy in an engineer's mind or work. Tell me, how did you improve the usability of some of the abstractions that your former team at Google, for example, was delivering?
Yeah, I mean, the empathetic engineering, Google had a nice concept of site reliability engineering, SRE. And it's this idea that reliability should be a feature of the product. And then they built a lot of discipline and tools around it. Like you can measure it. And so the thing about empathy is something that you have to feel. It's a very human type of thing. And so if you're a Kubernetes engineer at that time, the first time I gave one of these workshops internally at Google, and you're like, hey, why do people find Kubernetes so difficult, right? You can just run kube-up.sh and you got a cluster. And I say, but then how do you manage it when those certificates expire that you didn't even know were there? And so that perception lacks empathy. So what's the best way to give empathy? Well, you got to have them try it. And I remember one of the first sessions, I said, all right, here's what we're going to do. And I think it was like an offsite, 100 engineers. You break up into teams of 4. And I'm showing them, here's how to bootstrap Kubernetes from the ground up. See how easy it is? Super simple. You just saw me do it. Now what I want you to do, the people who work on GKE and Kubernetes core, there's no excuses in this room, right? These are some of Google's senior engineers. Yeah. All you have to do in 1 hour is install Kubernetes. That's it. But you cannot use the scripts that we have. And so the team is kind of going through this process like, what version of Linux should we use? What version of Docker should we install? Do we really need etcd? What about the Kubernetes controller manager? Where do you even get the binaries from? Like everyone that works on this thing every day is kind of lost because they never really had to install Kubernetes from the ground up. And so they go through this process. After an hour, some people get further than others. Some people still stuck debating which version of Docker to use. And so I asked them to all present what approaches they tried. They had to record every Google search they made, every piece of documentation, every command they used. And so people were presenting like, yo, this is harder than we thought.
You bet.
We didn't know how many assumptions we were making to the average person coming to our community for the first time, right? System administrators want to know how things work. And so none of their tools, you couldn't do yum install Kubernetes. You can't do apt-get install Kubernetes. So we broke the whole model for those people. And so since they got to feel it, they approached the problem solving now with empathy. And so one team did kubeadmin, right? It's a little utility that you can progressively install Kubernetes. And the thing they also did was make sure that there was Debian and Red Hat packages for the components of Kubernetes, because guess what? There's dependency management. So if you say yum install the kubelet, it knew what version of Docker to bring in that was compatible with that. And so the empathy was, oh, there's already tools that these people are familiar with. Let's make sure that they can use them. So if we ever had to go through this exercise again, it should be almost a one-liner, yum install Kubernetes. And I think part of the empathy was, well, what happens when you don't need all of Kubernetes across multiple machines? So kubeadmin did pretty cool things. It did like, hey, let me do a check to see if your OS is even meeting the requirements. All right, look good there. Now let's do the kubelet, or let's do the server side, where we bring in the API server, the controller manager, and then verify everything is good. And some people like that approach, that now you had this tool that can walk you through the installation process and help you learn as you went. I also decided to write, maybe a little bit before then, Kubernetes the hard way.
Yeah, I heard about it.
Because empathy also taught me that sometimes you don't want it just to be done with a click of a button. Sometimes you want to just see all the pieces and how they fit together. So that way you have the confidence of like, if this thing breaks, I know how it's supposed to work and I can go put it back together, or I can kind of look where the components are supposed to behave in a certain way that are not currently. And so shipping those things, I think it made people really understand the value of something like GKE, Google's Kubernetes engine, that you click one button and the thing not only created a cluster for you, the server and the nodes, but it also told you what it did. Hey, here's a description of what we did. The nodes are at this version. You can kind of look behind the covers if you want. All the configs are still there. We're not hiding them on private infrastructure where you can't see them. So I think a lot of empathy went into that. And there's countless examples of asking people to do very simple things like connect this app to a pub sub server, and that being 50 steps when it should have been just 2. And then them changing the product so it can just be 2 steps. And so it's things like that where I think, to me, when you have smart engineers that can write all the code that you tell them to write or they inspire to write, the thing that's typically missing is like the feel for what the final result should be. And I think, in my opinion, empathy goes a long way when you really feel it for yourself, and then you can be a better judge of whether it's done or not.
True. So dogfooding could be like part of the empathetic
Not just
engine?
dogfooding, but so like dogfooding, you can also go astray with dogfooding, right? Because if you know how it's supposed to work, sometimes you use the system as a design. And if you get lucky, maybe you try to do something that's unique, like you're dogfooding your own phone that your company makes, and it's like not taking great photos. And you say, oh, after using this to take photos, we should change it in this way. Yes, dogfooding can be good from that. But empathy, I think there's a bit of design around, at least what I try to do is shrink the timeline. I only get 1 hour to make you feel something. So that scenario needs to be kind of teed up a little bit. And yeah, some people do get empathy from dogfooding. Like, I think that is a good baseline. Use the things, if you can, that you build, 100%. But I think just letting people know that the point of doing this, I need you to feel like our customers feel. Like our customers are not getting free phones.
Yeah.
So you can't say this phone is great, but it costs $10,000. You're lacking the empathy to understand the full equation of using this phone.
True.
And so maybe some of the design decisions that went into this phone make it cost prohibitive for anyone to ever buy one. So I think empathy is that additional layer you put to make sure people understand what it's like to be a real person on the other side of this equation.
Sure. It's an amazing perspective. This one is not a tough one, but very interesting one, at least for me. Did you ever relate with situation when people have these obsessive ideas they're excited about and carry with them, they want to share, but fail miserably to convey its potential to the higher ups? I mean, like, this probably how products like Salesforce, Android, OpenAI saw the light when the idea is good. But, it's easy to imagine how heavy it can be when engineers feel like they're deaf and no one seems to hear them. Some just tell you, heck, take your idea and run away. But I believe there's something more. I mean, I'd like to get your insight on this and share anything that worked out for you in the past.
Yeah, I'll try to pick a simple example. When I was in that financial institution, we rewrote the payment systems. And the one old stack that was written in Java to a new stack that was written in probably better Java. And part of that was we were using the Apache web server with this module. It was this Java module that would actually do things like when you set the request to JBoss, JBoss could respond in a way to tell you that it had too much load and you shouldn't send any request to it. And then anything in that load balancer pool. So if you had 5 application servers behind it, maybe 5 different IPs, then this two-way communication would tell the load balancer that it should send the next request to the next application server. And so that was a really powerful feature, but boy, did it require a ton of RAM. And so what happened is when we got the new payment system and we were moving way more transactions on it, the application web server or Apache was falling over. So imagine, you're taking requests from Visa and MasterCard and people are trying to swipe these things and it just falls over. And what happens when things fall over, we do a stand-in. Either we automatically approve the transaction, maybe you're buying gas and your credit card is programmed to just say, who cares, even if your balance goes negative, or just flat out denies you when you're trying to buy something. That could be a very bad experience for people. And so I'm looking at this, and this company had been using Apache for a long time. It's just been working with the same config. You just don't touch it. And so I'm probably on that team, I don't know, maybe not even a year. And so I definitely didn't have any status or reputation to really kind of get people to listen to me. And it used to work. So people are, maybe it's like the new system and not this thing that's just like the smartest part of the equation. And so we used to have these change windows that started at midnight and they go to 6 a.m. And so I'm trying to figure out like what the hell's happening. All I know is when this thing gets a lot of requests, it runs out of memory and it crashes relentlessly.
Damn.
And so I'm sitting here like, man, what if I just try something different? And I remember researching, and it's like Nginx is a lightweight alternative to Apache. And its threading model was different to the point where it can handle way more concurrent connections. And I was like, man, the first thing I need to do is learn how to translate the Apache config to Nginx. But the problem though was there was none of this Java JMS thing to do the two-way thing. And I was like, damn, do we even need that though? I don't think we need it, because we were adding more backends and this thing still wasn't providing much value. So I said, hey, look, I'm going to set this up in dev. I'm going to use Nginx. I think I got most of this stuff, including all the weird redirect rules, all this magic stuff that had nothing to do with the app, but needed to be there for who knows production issues we were solving back then. So I got this Nginx thing. I'm like, yo, for my limited testing, this thing is using like 1/10 of the RAM, even when traffic starts to spike. Dope. And I'm telling people like, yo, I got a solution. They're like, dude, we're not changing Apache out. This thing has been certified, something, PCI, blah, blah, blah. So I'm sitting here, change window after change window, watching the team kind of fail to get this thing launched. And I remember one time we were in like one of the meetings like, hey, we got to fix this. We were trying everything. And at some point, I just started pleading with the team. I said, listen, all I need is just one shot. I bet my whole career on this thing. Damn. Apache in this configuration will never, ever, ever work. Nginx, I'm almost at the point like, I guarantee this is going to work. You failed like 8 times in a row. We're paying fines. We're losing. So just give me a shot. But here's one thing though. I need to be able to restart this web server 1,000,000 times as necessary during that change window, because I may have to tweak a few things. And I'm sitting here crossing my fingers, but honestly, I had so much confidence in that room that I remember one of the executives, she pulled me to the side. She was like,
Who are you?
I'm not sure everything you were talking about, but I believe you. I believe you. Like, I have a lot of confidence. Like, you seem very convinced about this, so my vote is yes. And so I remember making a deal with the CTO at the time. And I said, listen, if I get this working, you got to buy pizza for the whole team, right? Everybody, every day of the week, we want different pizza from different place. And he's like, dude, I'll buy you a steak dinner if you get this to work. And I remember I came in that change window, and I think a lot of people had a lot of confidence in me because I wrote a lot of docs. I was double checking everything. I was trying my best to break it. And we put that thing in the change window, and the memory usage just dropped.
Wow.
And everyone just sitting there was like, yo, is this going to work? So it's 6 a.m. now. We're like, all right, we're just going to leave it. And as 8 a.m. comes, 9 a.m., everything's smooth. The graphs, memory is down.
More users.
And you looking like a genius.
Wow.
Right? You're looking like, wow, this dude. And what I noticed is that if you're asking people to believe you, you got to back it up. Like, you got to be ready, and you have to understand what's on the line here. It's not just about having the technical implementation ready. You got to actually be able to inspire people to believe what you believe. And a lot of times people will present their technical solution and they are unsure. Like, you sure it's going to work? I don't know, man. I'm just saying, like, I like Ruby, and Ruby is better than Go, so I think we should just do Ruby. It's like, dude, that is not very convincing. No. I need more conviction than that. And so to me, I kind of understood that the way you present the solution is almost as important as the solution itself. And that's the buy-in. That's where the trust comes in. And bonus points if the technology backs you up.
Yeah, that makes sense. What if, for example, it's more a strategy or vision kind of thought instead of technical?
There's a part of my career where I think I really leveled up. I just stopped caring. Like, I used to be one of those people, like a lot of people in tech, I used to be battling on the whiteboard. No. We should be using Jenkins because of this reason, this, pros, cons, and just battling, trying to actually win. And you would win sometimes because after a few performances like that, and you start to build up a bit of credibility, you become kind of the go-to person. And so then you start winning maybe more than your fair share of technical arguments. Because if we're being honest with ourselves, you could have used either technology. We could have probably made it work with a better Apache config than just Nginx. And so one thing I learned, though, was you don't actually make a lot of friends when you win that way. Because then you just have a little bit too much power and authority, and it feels like it's you versus the team. And so I started to get real mature where I would catch myself debating and say, you know what?
Slow down.
If you really want to do this with what tool? TeamCity? I don't care. More than likely, we're going to run some steps in a certain order, and some bills going to pop out the other side. I don't know TeamCity. Most of the team doesn't know TeamCity, but your team is really excited about it. How about this? Let's convert a few of the jobs over from Jenkins to TeamCity, and then we'll just see how it goes. And here's the thing about that. When you kind of step back and you let that team run with it, you also have to be mature to, like, not stand back and just watch people fail so you can say, I told you so. That's not helpful either. And so what I caught myself doing is, like, let me just go learn TeamCity myself and be one of the first people that port a Jenkins job to TeamCity. And then realize, like, you know what? This tool actually is kind of nice. The UI is better. Some of the defaults are a little cleaner. I like the reporting. It's not terrible. And it didn't take long for me to port it. And when you send the email to the team and say, yo, I know you all want to try TeamCity, so I converted these 2 jobs. I'm not sure if I did it right, but I think I got it to work. It feels like it's right. So if you can highlight any issues, that would be great. So I can actually, learn enough about TeamCity to contribute. I think that was the point when people say, oh, this guy's on my team. It's one thing to be right. It's one thing that people can trust you to kind of take care of it. But it's another thing when people kind of feel like you'll give them room to succeed or fail. But even when you give them room, you're not like backing away and making them be by themselves. You're kind of saying, you know what? even though I kind of disagree, I'm good with that part. And now I'm going to pivot to be someone that's on the same team, hoping your idea works.
That's true empathy, I believe. Okay, this one is for the CTOs or startup founders. Could you weigh on the tough dilemmas that are faced by startup CTOs on whether to keep it simple, to use the KISS, monolith, managed, wherever, or go all in sophisticated frameworks, but with a higher burn rate and tech dates? Is that maybe an ego problem for some teams, or because today we have 17 ways of deploying a container, for example, in the cloud? How can a decent person make their mind, let alone a manager or CEO? Why not use Cloud Run or Monolith without the maintenance overhead? What do you think?
I've been in a position where I had to make a lot of those kind of key decisions. And the thing that I found the most helpful was to just explain the decisions and why you're making them. So let's say you're on-prem and you got VMware and you're using Puppet. And you just deploy your binaries using Puppet. Maybe you're fancy, you're using like a deb or RPM to deploy the app. And so one day the team's like, we want to go to the cloud and we want to start going to containers. Now, you could just say, we need to go to containers because that's the new thing. Everybody's doing it. What the hell are we doing? We're so far behind. And that's not really a good explanation. Like I get how that might make sense. It might even be true, but I can't see the work. When you're in math class, even if you get the math answer right, if you don't show the work, you're just guessing. You need to understand the formula and how you arrive to the answer. Sometimes is more important than just getting the answer right.
Yeah.
And I think the technology decisions are similar. So let's take that base scenario. So we go to the cloud and the team really wants to use containers. So say, okay, let's try it. Number one, I like to explain the decision. Today, RPMs only work on specific versions of Red Hat. You can sign them, you can use Yum, but the truth is there's nothing specific about an app that requires Red Hat. Mm-hmm. Also, there's no metadata that allows us to leverage something like Cloud Run, because Cloud Run, you have to have a container essentially to make it work. Or it's better when you do have a container to make it work. Same is true for Heroku. So now as someone was making this decision, knowing what I know, with all this maturity and this experience, I would say, before I propose containers, first thing I'm going to do is make sure that it actually works. I'm going to go and write a Docker file and say, what value do I get from this Docker file? Like, this Docker file syntax might be easier than a bunch of make files and random build instructions that people are using. So we get some consolidation. That's nice. Base images. Clean room build environments. Everyone hates a Jenkins host and dealing with all these build farm issues. So that's another thing. So here's what we're doing today. And here's some value I found is that we don't have to start making these very unique build agents, right? Because you only have 5 licenses for build agents in your CI/CD platform. Now we can make them all the same. And then we could just use Docker to make sure that we're doing something clean. And this is not new. This is what Mock does when you build RPMs in a clean room. It creates a chroot. It brings in all the things. So this is an old technology that we can bring to all of our apps now. It's like, okay, so here's what we're currently doing. And here's what the new tool allows us to do. Typically consolidate or raise other areas to the same level, even though they're not all running on Red Hat. Okay, now we're getting some value. And so now I say, hey, I want to propose a more unified way of building our applications. I would like to propose additional metadata so that way we can store, search, index, and leverage more platforms, including serverless platforms, fully managed platforms, and even VMs with a cleaner configuration. Right now, our Puppet code is tens of thousands of lines. I think for what we're doing, we'd be better off with an agent on the machine that just pulls down the app and leaves the host alone. Mm-hmm. Now, when you explain it this way, you're not saying, let's just go to containers. You're really explaining the benefits. Here's what we're doing. Here's what this tool allows us to do and get further along in our goals. And when you write that down, here's why I'm proposing we use containers. Now, you show it to a few people on the team, and they say, this is not true. This is not true. Great. Let me get my facts together, and I just want to make sure that we are using our best judgment based on the knowledge we have to get to this decision. And at the bottom of that doc, as of this date, all these things are true. If you join the company 5 years from now and you say, why the hell are we using containers? That's outdated technology. What I want you to see is all the things that were true when we made this decision. And if you want to change this decision, we expect the same professional level of analysis. Take our right column and make it your left column and tell us what you would like to do instead. And that way you can do the same work that we did. And if you arrive to the right answer, we will totally make the switch because we should make the switch because the math tells us we should make the switch. And I think that allows you to kind of deal with the fact that technical debt, a lot of it is based on trade-offs. Like you said, we had to launch by Friday or we're going to get fined by the government. So we made this trade-off. And sometimes when you read those trade-off docs, hey, we're using this super inefficient algorithm. We know it's slow. We ran the benchmarks. We know that these results are not good, but they're good enough. We suspect that in 2 years when our traffic doubles, this algorithm is going to become a hotspot and we should deal with it. And so when that 2 years rolls around, someone says, hey, remember, we did this for a reason. If you want to make it better, let's go ahead. And I think, honestly, when you have that kind of detail in place, people complain a little less. They stop complaining like, hey, you're an idiot. Or they stop contributing to incompetency, right? Now they can say, oh, you made a strategic trade-off. Now it's time to undo it. Okay, works for me.
So it's always important to provide a context for every decision you have, eventually.
I mean, I trust people more when I ask them a question and they can tell me the real answer. Because sometimes what happens is, and you've probably seen this in your career, people move around so much that sometimes the people who made those decisions aren't there anymore.
Exactly.
And so the team is like, why are we doing this way? And everyone's like, I don't know, man.
Yeah.
I didn't put this here. I wasn't part of this decision. I just maintain it.
Yeah.
And so then how do you get that group of people to take the risk of changing it? Right? That's really hard because they lack the context. They lack the level of confidence required to do something new. So I always try to keep that in the back of my mind. But when you meet someone that says, hey, I'm with you. I know that this is not the state of the art, but 10 years ago it was, and here's why. And so if we want to change it, I can help you change it, but just kind of keep the context that 90% of our customers require that old interface. So either you're going to recreate that old interface, but you just can't throw it away unless you can figure something out that keeps those other 90% of our paying customers happy.
True. And now I want to talk about a matter that's really underrated in the tech industry, a topic that's dear to me, and it's about the Black community in Silicon Valley. I wanted to have your take on some of the weird and surprising facts. For instance, I did some research and I'll share the info in the show notes. For example, we got only around 1.2% of the total venture capital funded in the US was raised by Black founders in 2022, according to a VC Human Capital survey. In terms of investors at VC firms, we have only 4% of the total numbers of VCs and 5% of employees at many top tech companies. I mean, you've even been asked yourself a question at KubeCon 2017. I record, how does it feel to be the only Black speaker in the event? One might ask why Black founders are still receiving significantly less funding than the other demographic groups. I know startup entrepreneurship isn't easy for anybody, regardless of race or gender, except if your name is Elizabeth Holmes or Sam Bankman-Fried. But how do we at least level the playing field so that everybody can have the same opportunity? What are your thoughts on this?
Man, the U.S. is so complex in this regard because a lot of people who aren't probably racist by intention probably benefit that exist. And when you benefit from something, even if it's bad, you're not going to be very proactive most of the time about dismantling it. Like, it's just a hard thing to ask someone to do when no one is looking.
Yeah.
And so what happens when no one is looking, the status quo does this thing. And so let's just say this data is true. I haven't seen it, but let's just say it is accurate.
I'll share the notes.
So you would say, if this data is accurate, we can see the results. The results are, this thing is not even. Now, we could make a number that we would say is fair. Let's say 8% would be more accurate. I don't know what the perfect percentage is. That what makes this other thing part hard. Because should it be 50%? Should it be the same percentage as the demographics? Should it be the same percentage of the demographics of people seeking funding? I don't know what the perfect number is, but they just say the number is better than what the current number is.
Yeah.
And then you ask, well, how did we get to the current situation? Right? This is whatever we are right now in reality is not theoretical. It is factual. So you say, well, how did we get to where we are? And you could ask all the people involved in this, founders, the LPs who give VCs money, the VCs who dole it out, the people who are doing due diligence. These are all the actors that are involved. And you would ask them, did you do this on purpose? My guess would be the majority would say they did not do this on purpose. Mm-hmm. Right? That would probably be the thing. And so one would assume we're just riding the status quo. And in this country, the status quo has been architected in a way where if you do nothing, you're probably going to end up with results you don't like. Because there are already counter forces in place structurally that lead to these kind of results. So I am probably saying that I would lean on the side that it's not intentional, but that's also kind of the fault of it all. Because we know if you do nothing, it's predictable where you're going to end up with. If someone told you, if we did no other changes and we just allowed it to be, we'll probably end up with the same numbers again.
Yeah.
So now I think the real question becomes is what should change? So some of the things that I think are changing, at least from my point of view, is the number of people who look like me who have money now is probably bigger than it has ever been in the history of the United States. People like Serena Williams have a lot of cash, and she does venture capitalist. LeBron James also does venture capital. So the LPs are starting to change a little bit too. And these people are getting in, and maybe they are also looking to diversify their portfolio. They know the value of all perspectives because they come from a different perspective. So I think as the LPs start to change, maybe we went from 0.8% to the 1.2 we have now. That may represent progress, but maybe not enough progress.
True.
And now that people like me, I've been in the startup world for a while now. I know how LPs work. I've cashed in on equity, private equity sales. I know how the lingo goes. I probably sit on at least 10 to 15 cap tables myself. I understand the difference between being employee number one, what the founders get, what the LPs get. Mm-hmm. There's a spectrum there. And I guess as we start to understand these differences in knowledge, also having data like this helps highlight the problem. So now we can go from ignoring the problem and just letting whatever else happen to saying this data is real. You can challenge the data, but now it's time to have that discussion. And so now I think there's a lot for all the actors to do. If you are a founder, and this is the conversation I have with my community, I'll say things like, listen, what is venture capital good for? Sometimes you have a really good business idea that can just work as a bootstrapped business, meaning you go get customers, you make more profit, and you build out the team to match the profit that comes in. I would probably say the majority of the businesses in the world work this way. And you probably can't make great use of capital. So if someone gave you $10 million, it doesn't mean that business is going to be on the path for accelerated growth. So True. I think knowing that VCs, venture capital is a new thing. Mm-hmm. It's not like something that has been around, I think, for hundreds and hundreds of years. This idea that VCs would take this amount of risk, spread capital in the way that they do, and hoping that a single-digit % of them actually make it, this is a new form of investing. Some say was only enabled by 0% interest rates. Mm-hmm. So I think we're starting to do the analysis of this. But now, though, there's a lot of business owners. So I come from a world, when I had that computer shop, bootstrap was the only method I could even imagine being a thing. I didn't have a strategy for what it would be like to open 10 stores across the state of Georgia. I only thought about what it would take to just run this one store with limited inventory that I can actually sell. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of business. So that's number one. There's nothing wrong with a business that actually makes money.
For sure.
And then the part around what type of businesses and ideas attract venture capital? For me, and I can't speak for the whole Black community, but for me, that's something that I've only learned probably in the last like 8 years of a 25-year career. You know, to have something worth a venture capital taking that level of risk, they want a huge outside return. And in some cases, only ideas that will work due to venture capital being injected, like Uber, cannot work without venture capital, right? They kind of like skirted the law and use, I'm pretty sure, a fair amount of that funding to deal with legal issues. You can't try to bootstrap that kind of company because I think you'll be crushed by the fact that the regulators will catch up to you faster than you can expand.
You bet.
And so I think now that these other groups are starting to learn what attracts venture dollars, what type of business scenario can only exist in the world of venture capital. So you'll get more of those. And I think as the LPs also grow in their diversification, seeing other success stories, they'll say, hey, I'm not going to be afraid of founders that look like that. Maybe they can start to look at some successes and say, oh, wow, this guy's really great, or she's really great in her venture. I'm going to invest in people that look like her. So maybe the numbers get better. But look, governments play a role in this. One good argument I heard on this was some of these funds are literally funds that come from pensions, the workers in the state. Not necessarily the state of California, but pick any state. And imagine that pool of money being drawn from a group that is way more diverse than those numbers. Ideally, the fund of people getting these opportunities for the capital should also be as diverse as the LPs that it's composed of. And I think now that people are seeing these numbers, seeing the transparency, you might start to ask questions like, hey, hold on. I may know some founders from different backgrounds that are not getting any of the funding, but they are qualified, yet you have no problem pulling from a diverse set of LPs. Then we need to make sure that we're like trying to do a good job of giving these opportunities to everyone versus people from a very limited circle. So that's the way I think about it. And the role that I try to play is one of the education, the number of 101s, the LPs that I work with, being an example. I'm in the advisory side. I have no interest of being a founder myself, but I am still interested in collecting equity and being part of this thing we call venture capital as well. And so I think educating people on how it works, learning from each other, and just sharing all of that knowledge. I don't know if it's still up, but I did a whole Twitter space with my friend Joseph Jacks. He runs a VC called OSS Capital.
Oh,
he's
nice.
really focused on investing in open source companies. But we did a whole rundown on how he's actually one of the other co-founders of KubeCon.
Oh, nice.
And Joseph Jacks is now a venture capitalist, and he invests primarily in open core, open source startups. And he talks about how to start raising your first fund, how do you track the funding, you know, how does he think about how he invests, the criteria he used for what he thinks is going to be a successful company. And I think that kind of knowledge is going to be really helpful for people that look like me that are trying to get into a world like that.
Interesting. And I don't know if you know the founder of Calendly, Awatona Topi. And he was pretty much opinionated about this because he experienced this sort of imbalance back in 2013. He was using the funds from his 401k. Then the money started to dry. And I'm just quoting him because at some point he told some of the reporters from Inc. magazine, and he told them, I had a working product and customers using it, and everyone said no. Meanwhile, I watched all the people who fit the different profile get money thrown at them for shitty ideas. So this is what he said related to his experience. But, you know, kudos for him because turns out it worked out for him because he stretched every dollar he had. And from 2016, Calendly was able to turn profit with the paying subscribers, right? But you always think, like sometimes you go through the nets because you handle it yourself, but does it have to be like this for the future generation?
Yeah, I mean, and I think stories like that and experience like that is definitely what people should be listening to. You know, I think venture capital should be accessible to all those that qualify. I think people agree that it currently isn't. I've been offered on the other side of the equation, especially once my kind of name got pretty well known in the industry, I've had VCs just come to me with ideas and say, the funding is ready to go. When you're ready, and don't even have a product yet.
Yeah.
It's like, whenever you're ready to do something, we're ready to do something. And I did find that kind of strange, but that is how a lot of founders, sometimes they're raising funds just on their name alone. Like, maybe they're
Trump
known or they know someone. They have some insight into how to get that funding. But look, I'm really glad that this conversation is here. I think we know a lot more about this space than we ever did before. And the Q&A example is another good example that for those that are unsure of where they should be investing their money, now you have some really good examples of what another profile of a worthy founder looks like. And so look, if you're a VC, your job is to turn these investments into profitable companies and actually get a return.
Absolutely.
And so if you're going to cast a wide net, make sure you ain't catching the same fish.
True. All right, let's bring it home with one final question. Bob Marley's final words to his son Ziggy were, "Money can buy life." I realize we have the same age, you and I, although you're light years away. But I really like it here, brother. I think as we grow older, we all learn to love our pace. However, what piece of wisdom would you give to the young bloods that are super hungry today and want to crush it out there so soon and become the next Sam Altman or Zuckerberg or Kelsey Hightower? What would you tell them?
I don't know, man. I would say, you got to understand that the circumstances will always be different for each of us. What's that saying that, no man can cross the same river twice, because when they do, the man and the river will be different each time. And so when you look at these examples, there's no way you think that you can just copy these exact blueprints. And I think in some ways, do you really want to? Right? And I think that's the part where I think number one, being present during that grind. So look, there was a part where I was in full grind mode too. I was like, I'm going to learn everything I can about Unix. I'm going to be the best Unix person ever. And then you figure out that the best Unix person ever only gets paid so much. And then you're like, oh, the world is bigger than just Unix. It's much bigger than just Unix. And then I started to zoom out a little bit. And a lot of us, when we zoom out, some people tend to only go down the stack. So maybe you go from it's all about Unix to it's all about the CPU, instruction sets, how electricity works. It's up to you. And sometimes we go up, where we go to where the humans are, like what things help actual people do things better. What kind of solutions does society need? Maybe look in the places that most people aren't paying attention to. But either way, though, as you kind of motivate yourself to keep going. So maybe the grind is the thing that drives you, wanting to be a billionaire. Maybe that's the thing that drives you. What I found for me, though, is that it became unsustainable to try to figure out, can you be the richest person ever, or what it means to be a billionaire? Because the needle kind of keeps moving. Right? I remember there was a time where if you just made six figures, that was the end of the world.
Yeah.
That's
Big deal.
Whatever you want. Now some people are saying they can't even pay their bills at six figures.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, and I'm not saying this is going to work for everyone else, I spent some time just trying to figure out who I was. And that meant I know who society wanted me to be. If I watched certain TV or certain things, they wanted me to be this person. Society may want you to have the fancy car so they can say you made it. Right? It can even be your family members.
Yeah.
Say,
Sometimes
hey,
it's family. Yeah.
Sometimes it's family that puts the stress on you. You need to go to school. You need to get married. You need to buy a house. You need to do exactly these things in this order. And if you don't do them, they may make you feel like you haven't done things the right way.
True.
And this becomes super stressful. And so, look, you're going to always have that outside pressure. Some of it will be motivational. So I'm not saying dismiss it all. But for me, when I really took a break and said, hold on, stop. Why do I care about this stuff? And when I got comfortable saying, I don't care about this stuff. When I proposed to my wife, I bought a cubic zirconia ring.
Wow.
The only thing that makes that ring fake is the mindset you bring into the equation.
Yeah.
People think you got to spend $10, $20, $30, $40,000 for this little ass rock.
Yeah.
I spent $1 for the stone, maybe a couple $100 for the real metal, but $1 for the stone. And I explained to my wife, I was like, listen, I could spend way too much money on this real diamond and we can be in debt and, you know, you can continue to have debt or whatever, or we can stay debt free.
Yeah.
We can catch $79 round trip tickets to the Bahamas to get married. Why are we spending $5,000 to rent a facility when I can fly to the beach and get married on the beach for $79 each way?
Wow.
And I was like, what's real? And I just made sure that what real mattered to me. So like the whole diamond thing is like, that's insane. And then to this day, when people see some 𝐞𝐸 zirconia, they're like, oh my God, because they say, you're Kelsey. It must be real. How can it not be? So that 𝐞𝐸 zirconia is more real than any diamond I could ever buy because of who I am. And so to me, I think the thing that's important here is find what motivates you. Expect it to change over time. But when you get to that part where you kind of figure out who you are, I haven't found anything more sustainable than being that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you accept the first label that's given to you. And then you say, oh, okay, I'm this new HR title that I was given. Yeah. To me, I had to consistently challenge every step of the way. Like, hey, hold on. I'm getting too comfortable as a software developer. Is that all I am? I'm getting too comfortable as this particular thing. Is that all I am? And then it kind of helps you kind of recalculate as you make progress. So my advice to them is like, pay attention to the details. Don't forget that you're building your story. And if you go too fast and you don't pay attention to the details, 20 years from now, you won't have any stories to tell because you went too fast. You don't recall the names. You don't recall the scenarios. You didn't stay long enough to succeed or fail. And you don't have a lot to share in terms of what you've learned. That to me is like the most important part of the equation that I was able to leverage throughout my life. So there's no singular path, but that one part where you can just kind of hit that pause button and kind of decide what part makes the most sense for you, double down on that and get over the fear of telling your parents that you disagree. HR, I disagree. And then finding something that you can agree with, man, that's sustainable.
Yeah, right on, man. Wise words. And yeah, as you said, always have that time where you pause and self-reflect and enjoy the ride while you're at it, I guess. All right, I got a surprise quiz for you.
Uh-oh.
If you're in, hip hop kind of quiz, okay? And I'm calling it, what kind of Kelsey are you? It's a bunch of questions. You'll just tell me which one you choose. That would define a Kelsey. No pressure. You ready?
Yeah, let's go.
You ready, Mace?
Party people in the place to be. It's about that time for us to.
Yeah.
All right. Question 1. Biggie Smalls or Tupac Shakur?
Tupac Shakur only because of songs like Dear Mama and Brenda's Got a Baby.
Oh, okay.
His ability to go to that side where it wasn't about the clothes, the jewelry. Not saying that Biggie Smalls wasn't capable. But when you hear a song like Brenda's Got a Baby and you watch the video, that tells me that he was paying attention to the most uncomfortable topics and he chose to put it in the song and it was still good. That's the difference maker for me.
Okay, I take it. I know it's tough one. Next one, old school or new school?
The thing that's special about old school is that it's the stuff that lasts. And so, look, we're always 10 years away from the next genre of the next thing becoming old school. Like, people telling me that JC is old school.
Yeah.
What? Right? So,
He's still there.
Old school, new school designation is all just a temporary label. But I think the thing about old school for us is it's the stuff that we are saying is worthy of being remembered. And so as that scale continues to move, we go from the 80s being old school to the 90s being old school to the 2000s being old school. I think what we're really saying is that this is the stuff that's worth remembering from hip hop. All the experiments are great, but it's only when the time goes by that we still appreciate that music.
True.
That's why old school is so great. It's almost like the thing you want to become. You want to get to the point where whatever you've made stands the test of time and can fall into the old school bucket.
True. I got you. It's more truth school then, not old school only. All right, number 3, vinyls or digital beats? What'd you say?
So the thing is, I don't own any vinyl, even though my wife is going to put a record player in her office. The thing I like about digital, though, is the accessibility part. You know, as someone who kind of works in the technology world, when I use tools like Spotify, I remember Napster back in the day.
Yeah, I do.
Having access to the world's music is really hard to do with vinyl. So even though people love that vinyl sound,
Collection.
they can sit down and appreciate it. It's the access to music that makes digital, to me, like my preferred medium. Because, you know, how do you get access to 1 million songs without having room for 1 million pieces of vinyl?
Okay, valid point. Next one is breakdancing or graffiti art.
I'm going to say breakdancing because I never did graffiti, but I definitely did some breakdancing in middle school.
Wow.
I remember growing up in Long Beach, California, the school dance. I remember I used to learn a little bit of breakdancing. Wow. I could do backflips. I learned how to do a little bit of windmilling. Ooh. And I used to just love it's one thing to watch people break dance. So if you ever seen like Electric Boogaloo or Beat Street, it's so cool watching the choreography of people just doing that. And then the influence breakdancing has had on all forms of dance. But when you're in that battle circle, I don't care how good you are or not. It's just that when that circle forms and you know it's about to be your turn, it feels like the whole world is watching you. And when you're doing freestyle, it doesn't matter what you do, right? Because what people are looking for in any breakdancer is their own style. Like Crazy Legs, you know what he's about.
True.
And so when it comes to like breakdancing, it's that part where it's like, oh, Turbo and Ozone, 2 different styles, but you can't wait to see them do both. So I'm a big fan of breakdancing. Whether it's good or not is different, but boy, what an amazing art form.
Damn. Never thought Kelsey was a b-boy. Okay. All right. Adidas or Nike? This one's tough.
You know what? I'm pretty sure as it pertains to hip hop, a lot of people would lean towards Adidas, Run DMC. But I'm a Nike person because when we talk about fashion and culture, to me, Nike always represented like the athletes. And athletes in hip hop kind of go hand in hand, at least when I grew up. Like Deion Sanders, you know, the amazing cornerback, also made a song with MC Hammer. Shaquille O'Neal, the Hall of Fame basketball player, also made a song with Biggie Smalls. And so to me, like hip hop was a thing that was like the soundtrack to my athletic life. And so getting the new Jordans or getting the new Deion Sanders shoes, it kind of represents my part of the culture. So Nike has always been to me like the way I reflected my culture on my feet.
Tell me about it. Well, this one is obvious since you're actually from both sides. So what would you take? East Coast vs West Coast sound.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to take the South.
Okay.
Because when I was on the West Coast, I remember the first time living in Long Beach hearing Warren G come on the radio.
Yeah. Regulate?
No, Indo Smoke.
Okay.
It was from the Above the Rim soundtrack, I believe. Because to surprise, before that, there was like no Long Beach. It was Compton, Too Short in Oakland, but not Long Beach. And I remember hearing Long Beach on the song. I was like, oh, that's where I live. And then the whole movement kicks off. You get the Twins, you get Snoop Dogg, you get Warren G, you get Dr. Dre starting to collaborate way more with the Long Beach artists, you know, of course, Snoop Dogg. And so then it's like, okay, this Long Beach thing. So it felt good because that was my hometown. But I could never get over the fact at that time, personal opinion, that the lyricists like Nas and the way Biggie Smalls was putting words together, Rakim, I Ain't No Joke. When I heard those rhymes, it's like, ooh, what'd he say?
Yeah.
I gotta hear it again. And so I always gave credit to the East Coast for having this lyrical superiority. At least that was my vibe. Like Wu-Tang, I just felt there was something they were doing lyrically. I felt West Coast was like putting together the best combination of lyrics, the music, and exploring all the sampling that Dr. Dre was doing. But when I got to Atlanta and hearing like Outkast it felt like there was always conscious rap, like Mos Def, Talib Kweli.
Yeah.
You got a lot of that. But when I came to the South and you heard Goody Mob and Outkast, it felt like they were coming from a center place, like this voice that was forgotten. A lot of these people that were in New York, Snoop Dogg is from Mississippi. Mm-hmm. The South voice wasn't represented in that way. It was like West Coast, East Coast.
East Coast.
That's it.
Yeah.
But then you got this other sound, and I knew, and I think they felt like they had to be different too. They had to have the lyrics. They had to bring something different to the table. And boy, did it sound amazing. It felt new. It felt different. They talked about a different struggle. I learned a lot about like history.
Yeah.
It was so much in that Southern voice that was missing from the equation.
Yeah.
And I remember that Source Awards where Outkast, I think they won an award for like the best rap album or duo. And I remember Andre going up there and said, the South got something to say. Because people were booing them, right? Because they didn't fit the East Coast or West Coast.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like the South is here. And so now you can hear the influence of the South in music today, whether it's East Coast or West Coast. So I really like the fact that the South kind of brought another dimension to hip hop that was missing for far too long.
I love Andre 3000, so I take that answer. Southern sound. Got you. Next one is Quincy Jones or Dr. Dre. I know Quincy is not a hip hop guy, but still a legend.
So here's the thing. I'm living the era of Dr. Dre.
Okay.
He's a perfectionist. You hear it in the music. You listen to the sound, the way he starts the album, the mixing, the mastering. Mm-hmm. It's incredible what he did to some of that music and the number of eras he's been a part of, from NWA gangster rap to the Long Beach thing. Remember, he goes to the East Coast and he brings the Firm together with Nas, Foxy Brown, AZ. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on to bring us albums like Compton that you start to hear some of the newer rappers, right? The first time I heard Problem and some of these other people. And he has this unique ear for finding like people you haven't heard yet, and he puts them together. Let's not forget the Eminem, Dr. Dre era.
Yeah, for sure.
Right,
that's
so
the last chapter.
Like, yeah, and he's like the doctor you come see when you need a hit. Even Jay-Z, if you listen to some of his best songs, Dr. Dre is involved. But the thing about Quincy Jones, the first time I heard Thriller, I said, how does this album only have 7 songs or 9 songs? And when you hear the remastered edition where Quincy Jones is talking about the records and how they came up with them, you can tell he may have been even more of a perfectionist in terms of like, we have to try to redefine music with every song. I don't know if he sampled a lot of music, but all I know is that when Quincy Jones was involved, it felt like they were making a new sound every time to be sampled later by others. And so I give a lot to that era. And also think about the time he was doing it. Mm-hmm. He wasn't doing it during a time where everybody had that ability. I mean, he became kind of this prototypical, I am the producer. I bring together the world's best to create the world's best. Yeah. So you kind of see it as this lineage. I don't know if we get a Dr. Dre if there's no Quincy Jones. And so I think him being this blueprint for what a mogul is, what a P. Diddy could be, what a Dr. Dre could be. And so to me, I always appreciate that. But that sound that they were making back then, you know, they said like studio time was very expensive. 2-inch reel, you can't come in there messing up and getting punched in all the time. Like, no. We need to get this right.
It's too
right?
bad.
And to produce that sound without all this digital equipment we have now, you got to take your hat off to it. So, but if I had to just pick one, you know, I got to go with the Dr. Dre, but I kind of see it as a spectrum of appreciation.
Okay. It's good to stay respectful. All right, the next one is Public Enemy or NWA.
The reason why I'm going to pick Public Enemy is because there were songs that I would listen to that would change my behavior. I didn't necessarily believe all the NWA stuff when I heard it, because it's like half of this shit's illegal. I have no desire to do half of it.
Yeah.
Some of the street reporting I had heard earlier from E40, Too Short, DJ Quick. So it wasn't the first time that I heard people try to tell these stories. Spice One. So it didn't have the same shock to me. So I think a lot of people in America, NWA was the first time they were exposed to gangster rap. So it was this huge monumental shift for them.
Mainstream, I guess.
It was mainstream. It took gangster rap mainstream, but I did appreciate the way they did it. I mean, they had legendary songs in there.
The vibe was
The Public
crazy.
Enemy.
Yeah.
It made me like think about remember that self-reflection that I talked about? Like, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
I think they were helping me understand like, hey, who are you? What is music? What is the music industry? What is it doing to you? Why are they dancing all the time? Do you really need champagne in every video?
Yeah.
Like those things really help me kind of recalibrate and rethink. And I think when music does that to you, it becomes a special place. So for me, there's lots of times where I can go back to listen to on purpose. I'll go back and listen to their music. Not a lot of times do I go back and listen to an NWA record. I might go listen to an 𝐒𝐶 record.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't find myself a lot of times looking at an NWA, like listen to an album by
Purposely.
NWA. That doesn't happen very often. So I got to go with Public Enemy.
Okay, got you. That reminds me of another song from The Roots. What They Do. I don't know if you remember the track. That was pretty nice back then. Like, you really changed my perspective on rap music and how it's pictured.
I was listening to an interview from Chuck D. He was on Drink Champs or something like that. And he said this dope phrase. He said, you're a master of your thoughts and you're a slave to the words you say. And you are free to think anything you want. But the moment you say it is when you are being held accountable by everyone else that hears it. And it's like, that's the level of thought that I think he was putting into his music all of those years. And he had just a great way of summing up what's what and giving people insight and detail into what was actually happening.
Right on, man. Another clash. That's it. Run DMC or Wu-Tang Clan?
Boy. But here's the thing that I liked about Run DMC. That sound with Rick Rubin, the Rick Rubin era to hip hop is masterful. From LL Cool J to Run DMC, the way they kind of just mixed the various genres, the way he did with the 808, all of that is beautiful.
Yeah.
But ain't nobody touching Wu-Tang. Wu-Tang had so many personalities in one group.
Yeah.
That every record, you didn't know really what to expect.
Yeah.
And I think their form of lyricism, like the way they kind of put together the words, it's almost like they were in this competition to put together as many metaphors as you could
in one verse.
In the verse and time that they had. But I also felt like the competition that they had amongst each other to get on each record, I'm pretty sure not all of them were able to get on all the records. That it probably was like lyrical gymnastics for them. Like, hey, okay, you got to come better. You got to come better. And I think they also perfected their own styles. ODB,
Method Man,
honorary member, Method Man, Raekwon, the RZA, the GZA. And sometimes your least favorite Wu-Tang member would surprise you on a song.
Yeah.
I think there's a song called It's Yours. And it's from one of the newer albums that they did. And it was like, he's never been on my list of the top 10, but his verse is so crazily good. I'm like, wow, okay. And so to me, I think there was so much diversity in the group that it kept me listening to full albums because they had the ability to mix it up more. But yeah, Run DMC is a classic, but boy, Wu-Tang shaped too much of my career for me to ignore.
I got you. Now I think this one is the last one. The clash is Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat. I know it's not hip hop, but since we just talked about Wu-Tang, I thought it would be nicer.
But it come from that era because I used to go to 7-Eleven and play both of those games. You know, you get you like 6 quarters.
Yeah, well, tell me about it. Like the same generation, so.
You know, I'm going to pick... I actually prefer Street Fighter, but I'm going to tell you why Mortal Kombat is so special. I think Mortal Kombat was like the first game that I could actually learn the moves to. It's a very simple control scheme. You pick your favorite character, and they all had like 6 or 7 moves. And that fatality made winning that much better. Like when you win in Mortal Kombat and you hit the fatality, it's like people don't even want to play no more. It's like, why'd you do that to me? I don't want to play anymore.
Finish him.
And it was the first time that I felt that there was a clean, like that transition from 7-Eleven, the arcade, to the Nintendo with the blood coat on, or Genesis. You were playing the same game that was in the arcade. So I don't think the fight mechanics were better at all. But I definitely think that fact that I could actually learn Scorpion's moves and Sub-Zero moves and Raiden's move and feel like I was in control of those characters. Because when it gets to Street Fighter, when you play someone that's good, you might as well just put the controller perfect.
Yeah.
It's like I don't know, man. Should I block? Should I kick? Should I just spam these buttons?
Yeah.
But Mortal Kombat felt like this balance between, if you know the moves, because they weren't too hard to learn, you can actually play that character and feel like there was a big difference between Sub-Zero and Raiden.
Got you. For me, I actually played Street Fighter on arcade, and PC was Mortal Kombat. I never played Mortal Kombat on an arcade. So for me, like, best memory was Street Fighter because I was hitting the arcade every day after school.
I'll tell you what fighting game really was like the game I used to play all the time was Taken.
Oh, yeah. I remember that too.
When it went 3D, when that 3D where you could actually just...
It wasn't real 3D though. They were squares still.
But remember when you're a kid, it's 3D.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Right? Like when you're a kid, you're like, oh, did he just sidestep?
I remember.
Right? And then when, what was the dude, King? He would grab you and start swinging. And it was just kind of like, I had never saw a game that had more than just this kind of flat set of dimensions before. And I remember trying to get really good at that game. So Taken was, and then the storyline, like, you know.
Whatever. It just fights.
Let's be honest. None of them had really good stories.
Yeah, it just fight.
But it felt like I wanted to win with each character.
Nice. I remember that one. Actually, I had an extra question that was about Sega Genesis or Nintendo 64. But I left it aside. But you can answer.
N64. You know what? N64 was when I think Nintendo lost their way.
They started to.
Because I remember the controller was different. I wasn't into things like Mario Kart. And I felt like Sega Genesis was bringing like more of the games that felt like, I don't know, the sports games, maybe the fighting games. I just think that I felt like Nintendo, it felt like I outgrew Nintendo, if that makes any sense. You know, you went from Nintendo NES, Super Nintendo, you know, Mario 3. And then it was like, what happened to TurboGrafx 16? I'm not sure it worked. But then Genesis came. Sega does what Nintendo don't, right? And it was like, oh, look at these games. And I felt like Nintendo was always suppressing like the type of games you could play. Hey, that's too violent. That's not good for kids. You can't play it. You can't play it. And then seeing Sonic. And Sonic was like, wow, like there's a different approach to making games. And I felt like Sega was just bringing in like a new thing because they were trying to be better. Ultra Beast. Like, I was like, okay, Sega felt like the arcade. So I think it was all about Sega for a little while. Like, you know, some of the boxing games. I was like, okay, this is a different feel, a different vibe. But if you ask me today, I think Nintendo is king because they actually understand video games. Now when I go back and play these games, they were making games. Like the Zelda games, you transported to a different world.
In the universe.
They were patient. The ending meant something. It was just not button mashing with great graphics. I think Nintendo's like, look, you don't need the world's best graphics to make the world's best games. And I think now, if you ask me, Nintendo Switch to me is my favorite console because it feels like you can't lean on great graphics. You got to make great games.
Yeah. They stayed true, actually, over the years and decades. By the way, Genesis used to be called Mega Drive in Europe. They didn't call it
Mega Drive.
Yeah, Mega Drives.
But you know what? When they did Sega CD, it was over. That's when I was like, okay, I think we made a mistake here.
Where are we going? Crazy. Love it. So, say less, man. And I know everyone knows you, but in case a listener just woke up from a coma, where can he or she find you?
Yeah, I mean, I prefer these days for people to email me, kelsey.hightower@gmail.com. I'm spending more or less and less time on Twitter these days. Like, I'm giving the whole social media thing a rethink, but
Tell me about it.
I'm still on Twitter at Kelsey Hightower. But honestly, I've been taking a lot more time to read people's email and answer them thoughtfully So if you send me email to kelsey.hightower@gmail.com, more than likely you're going to get a response.
100% word. And I confirm this because this is how I got in touch with you, right? So it doesn't happen all the time. So I actually salute you for that kind of initiative, because I guess you have a lot of spam, but you're doing it for the right cause, the right purpose. And I really appreciate and salute that kind of initiative from a person like you. Right on, man. Whew. So many lessons and incredibly inspiring. Every engineer should absolutely listen to this episode. I can't believe I just hustled you, brother. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for taking the time and your patience. I loved learning from you in this interview. That was super extra dope. We even had some fun with that quiz at the end. We talked about hip hop and West Coast and all that stuff. That's how we make it more entertaining beyond just nerding about tech. And I just want to thank you, and I want to tell you, come back anytime, brother. You're always welcome, man.
Awesome. I really enjoyed it, and that last bit was really dope too, so I appreciate it. Looking forward to this getting published.
Thank you so much. Okay, I hope you were as enlightened, entertained, and empowered as I was during this privileged exchange with my man, Kelsey Hightower, one of the most prolific speakers, as he spread his wisdom in this captivating episode. And props to you, dear listeners, for sticking with us. Your support means a lot, so please share and hit subscribe on Spotify or YouTube to stay tuned, people. You're listening to Tech Beats Unplugged, and I'm your host, Cloud Dude. Catch y'all next time. Until then, keep grooving, baby. Signing off.